The Supernatural Sommelier. A paranormal rom-com where love is bottled, trouble is brewing, and the wine has a mind of its own. By Wynn Valentine. I2I Hype, LLC. Copyright 2025 by Wynn Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored, or transmitted in any form by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, scanning, or otherwise without written permission from the publisher. It is illegal to copy this book, post it to a website, or distribute it by any other means without permission. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities, is entirely coincidental. Wynn Valentine asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco. Chapter 1, Tasting Notes, Hints of Disaster with a Gloomy Finish. Zinnia adjusted the delicate tendrils of her prize color-changing vine, its crystalline leaves catching the autumn sunlight in shimmering rose-gold waves. The market square buzzed with pre-festival energy that tickled her supernatural senses like champagne bubbles on her tongue. Just a smidge to the left, she murmured, repositioning a particularly dramatic spiral. The vine seemed to preen under her attention, its colors intensifying to match her growing excitement. Around her, other vendors rushed to perfect their displays, while enchanted lanterns bobbed overhead like tipsy fireflies. The aroma of mulled wine and caramel apples mingled with crisp fallen leaves, creating what Zinnia's ability translated as childhood nostalgia with a dash of anticipation. She couldn't help but sample the emotional bouquet in the air, a habit that sometimes overwhelmed her, but today felt perfect for the autumn wine festival. Ladies and gentlemen, a voice rang out across the square. I see romance in the stars today. Madame Vesper, the local matchmaking diviner, had climbed onto an empty wine barrel. Her sparkly shawl caught the light as she gestured dramatically. The wine will flow and so will love. I guarantee every taster will find their match before sunset. Zinnia laughed along with the gathering crowd, though she detected the distinct emotional undertaste of desperate marketing in Madame Vesper's proclamation. As festival-goers filled the square, a trio of street performers began juggling bottles of luminescent wine that left trails of purple and gold light in the air. Zinnia's booth quickly drew attention, her vine responding to the collective joy by shifting through warm, happy hues. And now, she announced to her growing audience, holding up a crystal glass of amber liquid, this vintage carries distinct notes of first-kiss butterflies. She closed her eyes, letting her ability parse through the emotional threads woven into the wine. There's that moment of nervous anticipation, followed by a burst of joy and just a hint of awkward charm. The vine behind her shifted to a delicate pink with golden edges, perfectly matching the emotional profile she described. Her audience gasped in delight. This next one, she lifted a deep purple wine, tastes like sunrise hope, that perfect moment when the world feels full of possibility. The vine responded with a wash of lavender and coral tones that had several people reaching for their phones to capture the moment. A sudden dimming of the mood-sensing lamps caught her attention. The crowd's emotional flavor shifted from carnival delight to something more hesitant, like a sour note in a sweet dessert. Zinnia looked up to see Thorne Shadowmaker making his way through the festival, his cloudy aura preceding him like an uncomfortable silence. The festival coordinator, Mrs. Brightwood, hurried over with forced cheerfulness that tasted like artificial sweetener on Zinnia's tongue. Everyone, please welcome our town's botanical expert, Mr. Shadowmaker. He'll be ensuring our lovely displays stay fresh throughout the festival. Thorne's gray skin seemed even paler than usual as he approached Zinnia's booth, his hands visibly trembling as he eyed her vine. The plant, sensing his presence, curled its tendrils inward slightly. "The growth pattern seems irregular," he mumbled, reaching for a wayward tendril with shaking fingers. "I should trim it to maintain optimal health." "Oh, that's really not any see," Zinnia started, but it was too late. The moment Thorne's fingers touched the vine, his gloom magic leaked out like ink in water. The effect was immediate and devastating. The vibrant colors drained from the leaves, replaced by an ashen gray that spread like frost. The magic that allowed the vine to change colors sputtered and died, leaving behind a plant that looked like it had been carved from smoke. Zinnia felt the vine's distress, like a bitter taste in the back of her throat. The crowd's collective dismay washed over her in waves of disappointed soufflé and rainfall during a picnic flavors. "I'm so sorry," Thorne whispered, horror evident in his face as he stepped back from the ruined plant. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to help." The mood-sensing lamps dimmed further, casting shadows across the festival that hadn't been there moments before. Zinnia's ability picked up Thorne's emotions, a complex mixture that tasted like burnt coffee and shame with a strong aftertaste of self-loathing. It was so potent, it almost brought tears to her eyes. The festival goers around them shifted uncomfortably, their combined anxiety creating an emotional flavor that reminded Zinnia of stale bread and bitter herbs. She needed to do something quickly before the situation spiraled further, but the words stuck in her throat as she watched her precious vine continue to fade to grayscale. Zinnia's supernatural senses reeled as the vine's emotional signature transformed from vibrant joy to something dark and empty. The taste hit her like spoiled milk, bitter, hollow, and wrong. She pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting back a wave of nausea as the plant's distress flooded her system. "No, no, no," she whispered, watching helplessly as the last hints of color drained from the leaves. The vine, which had moments ago been preening with pride, now hung limp and lifeless, its crystalline surface dulled to the color of wet newspaper. The crowd's collective gasp created a surge of emotion that tasted like startled birds and spilled tea, sharp, scattered, and tinged with second-hand embarrassment. Zinnia forced herself to swallow past the acrid flavors assaulting her senses. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Her voice cracked as she turned to face Thorne. The wine bottles on her display table began to vibrate, their contents swirling with agitation. Beneath their feet, the cobblestones shifted restlessly, creating tiny ripples that spread outward like a stone dropped in a pond. Thorne's gloom aura pulsed darker, and Zinnia tasted his shame, a heavy sodden flavor like waterlogged cardboard. "I didn't mean to, I was trying to be careful," his stammered words trailed off as a nearby display of sunflowers bowed their heads in sympathy with his distress. Mrs. Brightwood bustled forward, her forced cheerfulness creating a cloying artificial sweetness that made Zinnia's teeth ache. Now, these things happen in a magical town. Perhaps we can." The festival coordinator's voice faltered as she took in the full extent of the damage. "Like burnt toast and regret," Zinnia muttered bitterly, naming the awkward tension that hung thick in the air. She could practically chew on it, the texture rough and ashy on her tongue. The mood-sensing lamps overhead flickered anxiously, casting uncertain shadows across the gathering. "I could help you cultivate a new vine," Thorne offered, taking a hesitant step forward. His gloom aura reached out like tendrils of fog, causing a nearby pot of marigolds to curl in on themselves. "I've been studying new techniques to control my condition. I think you've helped quite enough." Zinnia gathered the withered vine in her arms, its once proud tendrils crumbling at her touch. Each piece that fell felt like a small death on her tongue, tasting of goodbye letters and final breaths. The plant had been more than just a showpiece. It had been her partner in the emotional wine-tasting demonstrations that made her business unique. Thorne's departure left a wake of wilting flowers and dimmed lights. As he shuffled away, his shoulders hunched against the weight of countless stairs, Zinnia felt the air pressure change. Above them, clouds gathered with supernatural speed, their emotional signature heavy with unshed tears and unspoken apologies. The first drops fell just as Mrs. Brightwood attempted another cheerful intervention. "Perhaps we should take a brief intermission too," thunder cut off her words, and the rain began in earnest, carrying the distinct taste of melancholy and misunderstanding. Festival goers scattered like startled cats, ducking under awnings and into nearby shops. Their collective disappointment washed over Zinnia in waves, mixing with the rain to create a complex emotional cocktail that tasted of wet newspapers and canceled plans. Zinnia stood alone at her booth, letting the rain soak through her vintage dress. Each drop carried its own emotional signature. She tasted Thorne's regret in the larger drops, sharp and bitter like oversteeped tea. The smaller droplets held the crowd's gossip-tinged curiosity, fizzing on her tongue like questioning champagne bubbles. The market square had emptied quickly, leaving behind half-finished displays and abandoned wine glasses. The mood-sensing lamps cast weak, bluish light through the downpour, reflecting the town's collective melancholy. Even the cobblestones seemed to sigh beneath her feet, their usual warm energy muted by the emotional storm. She cradled the ruined vine, its once crystalline leaves now as dull as river stones. The rain didn't revive it, nothing could reverse the effects of pure gloom magic. Years of careful cultivation, countless emotional imprints, all the memories stored in its color-changing abilities, gone in a single well-meaning touch. The taste of the moment was almost too complex to parse. Layers of disappointment and frustration mingled with an undertone of something else, something that reminded her of missed connections and autumn sunsets. She pushed that last flavor away, refusing to examine it too closely. Instead, she focused on the simple, clean taste of the rain, letting it wash away the bitter remnants of the disaster from her supernatural senses. Chapter 2: The Bitter Aftertaste of First Impressions. Zinnia lifted the crystal glass to her lips, ready to guide her afternoon tasting group through the subtle notes of sunset contentment in her summer solstice blend when the front door chimed. The sound hit her like a discordant note in a symphony, and the wine in her glass suddenly tasted of metal and mounting dread. Her enchanted vines, usually swaying in gentle welcome, drew back against the walls as Thorne's gloomy aura preceded him through the door. Marigold Brightbloom practically pushed him inside, her solar magic creating tiny sparks that popped and fizzled against his perpetual storm cloud. "Careful with the 82 Moonberry," Zinnia muttered as Thorne's presence caused the bottles on her highest shelf to shiver. The taste of her customer's collective unease filled the room, something like burnt toast and morning anxiety. "Darling." Marigold's voice sparkled with forced cheer that tasted like artificial grape candy. "I've found the perfect solution to our little festival fiasco." Zinnia set down her glass, noting how the golden liquid had turned an unsettling shade of gray. "Mrs. Brightbloom, I'm in the middle of a... Thorne here will help maintain your vineyard. Free of charge, of course." Marigold beamed, creating another shower of sparkles that made Thorne flinch. "He's really quite skilled when he's not, well, you know." The customers at the tasting bar shifted uncomfortably, their emotions creating a cacophony of clashing flavors on Zinnia's tongue. She caught notes of awkward elevator rides and watching someone trip in public. "I really don't think," Zinnia started, but Marigold was already steering Thorne toward the indoor trellises. "Just look at these dead leaves. Thorne, be a dear and trim those while I chat with Zinnia." Marigold thrust a pair of pruning shears into his hands. Thorne approached the vines like they might bite him, which would have been funny if Zinnia couldn't taste his genuine distress, something like cold coffee and rain-soaked newspapers. He stretched out his arms, trying to maintain maximum distance between his body and the living plants while attempting to reach the dead foliage. Forcing herself to focus on her customers, Zinnia lifted a fresh glass of Joy Jubilee. "Now this vintage should taste of pure delight with notes of..." She paused, frowning as Mrs. Henderson took a sip. The emotional response was all wrong. Instead of bubbling happiness, Zinnia tasted plastic flowers and convenience store candy from the customer's reaction. A crash from the corner made everyone jump. Thorne had knocked over an empty planter, his gloom cloud darkening with embarrassment. The overhead lights dimmed further, and Zinnia's remaining customers began gathering their belongings. "Perhaps we could reschedule?" Mr. Peterson suggested, laying down payment for his unfinished flight. His disappointment tasted like canceled vacation plans. As the last customer hurried out, a bottle on the middle shelf suddenly exploded. Dark red wine sprayed across the wall, and Zinnia's supernatural senses were overwhelmed by the taste of crushed dreams and bitter almonds. She gaped at the stain. That particular vintage was supposed to capture the essence of first love, all butterfly wings and stolen glances. "Oh my," Marigold said, her sunny disposition flickering like a faulty light bulb. "Well, I'm sure once you two work together for a while." "Mrs. Brightbloom?" Zinnia interrupted, fighting to keep her voice steady as another bottle began to rattle ominously. "Could we discuss this solution in private?" The air grew thick with the taste of unfinished arguments and approaching storms, as Thorne's cloud cover expanded unconsciously. The remaining bottles clinked against each other nervously, their contents swirling with agitation. "I should go," Thorne mumbled, still clutching the pruning shears like a shield. A tendril of his gloom brushed against a thriving vine, causing its leaves to curl and pale. "I'm making things worse." "Nonsense." Marigold's voice created actual rainbows that dissolved in Thorne's darkness. "You two just need to adjust. Zinnia, dear, your talent for emotional wines makes you uniquely qualified to help Thorne with his little problem." "It's not a problem," Thorne and Zinnia said simultaneously, then stared at each other in surprise. The taste of shared understanding and mint tea briefly cut through the chaos of other emotions flooding the room. Zinnia pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to sort through the overwhelming sensory input. The lingering taste of the corrupted joy jubilee worried her more than she wanted to admit. Something was wrong with her wines, and now she had a gloomy fairy who killed plants with a touch being forced into her workspace. The remaining customers' earlier reactions played back in her mind, all slightly off, like instruments that had fallen out of tune. She caught Thorne watching her with an unreadable expression, his storm cloud seeming to pulse in time with her racing thoughts. Another bottle wobbled on its shelf, and Zinnia lunged to catch it before it could fall. The vintage inside, normally a swirl of childhood birthday wishes, now tasted of dusty attics and forgotten dreams. She set it down carefully, her gold-flecked eyes meeting Thorne's gray ones across the room. "Fine," she said finally, the word tasting of resignation and rainy Mondays on her tongue. "But we need some ground rules." Zinnia watched Marigold flit around her tasting room like an overexcited firefly, leaving trails of sparkles that made her nose itch. The solar witch seemed determined to orchestrate some sort of workplace harmony, oblivious to how her prized botanist was making every vine in the place cringe. "The first rule," Zinnia said, trying to ignore how the taste of awkward family dinners filled the air, "is that Thorne stays at least 5 feet from the premium vintages." Her mood-sensing vines, usually a reliable barometer of emotion, couldn't seem to decide how to react. They shifted from deep purple to seafoam green, and back again every time Thorne moved. The poor things looked seasick. Of course, Marigold beamed. "And Thorne dear, do try to contain yourself a bit more." The gloom fairy's cloud contracted slightly, though it still leaked what tasted like forgotten umbrellas and missed connections into the atmosphere. Zinnia sighed and turned to her inventory sheets, hoping Marigold would take the hint and leave. Instead, the solar witch perched on a bar stool, radiating helpful intentions and artificial sweetener. Zinnia's teeth ached. As she worked her way through the shelves, each bottle she tested confirmed her worst fears. The 2019 First Kiss blush, usually effervescent with butterfly wings and stolen glances, now carried an undertone of department store mannequins and recycled confetti. The Midnight Memories port had lost its starlight and whispered secrets, in favor of something that tasted distinctly like photocopied photographs. "Something's wrong," she muttered mostly to herself. "These emotions, they're fake. Like someone's trying to counterfeit feelings." Perhaps a cataloging system, Thorne's quiet suggestion startled her. He'd been so still in his corner that she'd almost forgotten him. To track the changes over time? Zinnia's first instinct was to dismiss the idea. What did a gloom fairy know about emotional wines? But when she automatically tasted the intention behind his words, she found nothing but fresh notebooks and carefully organized pencils, genuine helpfulness without artifice. "That might actually work," she admitted reluctantly. The vines flashed a confused lavender. Before she could elaborate, the shop's door chimed. Mrs. Rosewood, one of her most loyal customers, stormed in clutching a half-empty bottle of Celebration Sparkle. "Zinnia, dear, we need to talk about this vintage." The elderly woman's distress tasted like burnt birthday candles and popped balloons. "I served it at my garden club meeting, and half my guests went from laughing to crying to singing show tunes in the span of 10 minutes. Zinnia uncorked the bottle with trembling hands and took the smallest possible sip. The sensation hit her like an emotional tsunami: carousel music and spinning teacups, and vertigo and sugar crash, and first day of school and goodbye parties, all whirling together in a dizzying mess. She barely managed to set the bottle down without dropping it. "I'll issue a full refund, Mrs. Rosewood. And please don't drink any more of it." After the customer left, Zinnia began pulling bottles from the shelves for testing. Thorne silently grabbed a mop when one of them slipped from her grasp, the contents spreading across the floor in a puddle that tasted of mixed messages and misread signals. "Here, let me." They both reached for the same fallen cork, their fingers brushing briefly. The sensation was electric. The nearest vines flashed bright pink, and Zinnia jerked back so quickly she sent 3 more bottles crashing to the ground. The taste of static electricity and missed heartbeats filled her mouth as she scrambled to right herself. "I've got it." Her voice came out higher than intended. "You should maybe go help Marigold with whatever she needs at the gardens." Marigold, who had been watching the entire exchange with poorly concealed interest, finally took the hint. "Oh yes, come along, Thorne. We'll let Zinnia sort things out here." After they left, Zinnia sat alone in her tasting room, surrounded by suspect bottles and confused vines. She pulled out her leather-bound tasting journal and began making careful notes. 2020 Summer Joy, artificial sweetness underlying natural happiness. 2021 Twilight Dreams, tastes of synthetic starlight. 2019 First Dance, emotional resonance flat like recorded music instead of live. The list grew longer as she tested each vintage. Through her window, she could see the falls themselves beginning to shimmer with an odd metallic sheen, not silver like longing or gold like joy, but something altogether different. Something that shouldn't exist in Whimsica Falls. Her pen paused over the paper as she tasted the air. Even the ambient emotions of the town felt slightly off, like an instrument that had been tuned to the wrong frequency. The vines along her walls shivered, their colors shifting restlessly between purple and green and back again. Chapter 3: Something's Brewing at the Buzzing Bean. Zinnia's morning had barely begun when she spotted Pepper's frantic waving through the Buzzing Bean's window. The coffee shop owner's translucent wings were beating so fast they created a visible haze, and even from outside, Zinnia could taste the sprite's agitation, like burnt toast and scattered puzzle pieces. The shop's door chimed as she entered, the usually cheerful bells sounding more like a warning. Inside, the magical self-stirring spoons whirled in their holders like tiny silver tornadoes, and the enchanted coffee cups clinked against each other nervously. "Thank goodness you're here." Pepper zipped over, trailing sparkles of anxiety. "Something's terribly wrong with my coffee magic. The emotional infusions are all wonky." Before Zinnia could respond, a red-faced woman burst from her seat, mascara streaming down her cheeks. "This is the worst day of my life," she wailed, clutching a cup labeled Happy Chino. The door slammed behind her with a discordant jangle, and the mood-sensing lamps outside flickered wildly, cycling through colors like a broken rainbow. "That was supposed to be pure joy in a cup," Pepper whispered, her wings drooping. "Extra sunshine extract and everything." Zinnia picked up the abandoned Happy Chino, her professional instincts kicking in. She closed her eyes and took a careful sip. The initial taste was familiar, sunrise over dewy grass and children's laughter, but underneath lurked something else. Something that made her tongue tingle unpleasantly. It tasted like plastic flowers and carnival mirrors, with an artificial sweetness that reminded her of laboratory-created sugar substitutes. "There's definitely something wrong here," she confirmed, setting down the cup. "The emotional resonance is corrupted." Pepper darted behind the counter, returning with a leather-bound ledger that smelled of fresh ink and worried footnotes. The pages fluttered open of their own accord, revealing a list of recent incidents written in Pepper's looping script. Tuesday, peaceful chai caused 3 separate bar fights, Zinnia read aloud. Wednesday, love latte made an engaged couple cancel their wedding. Thursday, serenity smoothie induced panic attacks in the entire book club. The enchanted receipt paper on the counter crumpled itself into tight balls, sharing their distress. A familiar shadow fell across the page, and Zinnia's stomach did an unwelcome flip as Thorne's cloudy aura filled the doorway. But to her surprise, the overworked coffee machines, which had been whistling like tea kettles having nervous breakdowns, gradually quieted. His natural gloom seemed to counteract their manic energy. "I saw the commotion," he said softly, ducking to avoid a particularly energetic floating cup. The ambient magic felt unstable. Zinnia pressed her lips together, fighting the urge to dismiss him outright. But she couldn't deny that his presence was already helping stabilize the shop's chaotic atmosphere. "Fine," she sighed. "You can stay. But don't touch anything." She moved behind the counter, examining Pepper's equipment with growing concern. The magical measuring spoons all tasted normal, precise portions and careful calculations. The enchanted water filter still produced properly purified drops that sang of mountain springs and morning mist. But when she reached the bean grinder, her senses screamed a warning. Along its brass edges was a faint residue, silvery and strange. Zinnia touched it with one fingertip and immediately regretted it. The taste was like nothing she'd encountered before, mercury moonlight and corrupted dreams, with a chemical undertone that made her think of laboratories and experiments gone wrong. "Pepper," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "How long has this residue been on your grinder?" The sprite zoomed over, squinting at the machine. I don't know. I clean it every night, but lately it seems to get that shimmer no matter what I do." Thorne stepped closer, his shadow falling over the grinder. The residue seemed to react to his presence, growing slightly duller. "It's similar to what I noticed in the botanical gardens," he murmured. "On the leaves of the night-blooming jasmine." Zinnia wanted to ignore him, but the taste in her mouth, artificial starlight and manufactured memories, was too similar to what she'd found in her wines. She pulled out her tasting journal and added another entry. Contamination found at buzzing bean. Magical residue affects emotional infusions. Chemical signature matches wine alterations. Possible connection? The coffee machines had finally settled into a gentle hum, but the mood-sensing lamps outside still couldn't seem to decide what color to display. Zinnia watched as they shifted from rose to azure to amber, reflecting the confusion that filled the air like invisible smoke. "We need to test everything," she declared, pulling her hair back into a practical knot. "Every bean, every blend, every magical additive. Something is corrupting the emotional essence of this town, and we're going to figure out what it is." Zinnia tried to maintain her professional composure as Pepper zipped around the buzzing bean, trailing anxiety sparkles that tasted like scattered thoughts and fizzy unease. The sprite's wings hummed at a frequency that made the coffee cups dance nervously in their saucers. "It's not just the coffee," Pepper whispered, though her version of whispering still carried across the empty shop. "The matchmaking committee is in shambles. Their love predictions last week told the Peterson twins they'd find romance with a lamppost and a particularly charming garden gnome." "That doesn't sound too far off from their usual predictions," Zinnia muttered, but Pepper was already darting to the window. "And the weather? Look." She pointed outside where sunshine and storm clouds played tag, creating patches of rain that moved like spotlight beams across the cobblestones. "It's been doing that for days. The emotional forecast is completely scrambled." Thorne cleared his throat, and Zinnia reluctantly turned toward him. His perpetual cloud cover seemed darker than usual, but his voice was steady. "The residue? I've seen something similar in old botanical texts. It's an alchemical catalyst, typically used in emotion-affecting potions. Extremely rare and highly regulated." The gossiping ferns in the corner of the coffee shop rustled enthusiastically. "He's right, you know," they whispered among themselves. "We heard all about it from our cousins in the gardens. Very suspicious business indeed." Before Zinnia could process this information, the shop's delivery bell chimed. A package materialized on the counter, wrapped in brown paper that seemed to shimmer slightly in the fluctuating light. Zinnia's taste buds tingled with warning before she even touched it. "New supplier?" she asked Pepper, who shook her head, sending sparkles everywhere. "I didn't order anything." The sprite hovered uncertainly over the package. Zinnia carefully unwrapped one corner, letting the aroma hit her palate. The taste made her recoil, honey-coated lies and artificial dreams, with an undertone of smuggled moonlight and counterfeit wishes. She squinted at the shipping label, but the letters seemed to dance and fade before her eyes, leaving only smudges of ink behind. "Well, that's not ominous at all," she said, pushing the package away. Her fingers tingled where they'd touched the paper. Thorne pulled a worn leather notebook from his pocket. "We should map this out. Track where the disturbances are occurring." His gray fingers sketched a quick outline of Whimsica Falls, and Zinnia found herself leaning in despite her reservations. They marked each location: the Buzzing Bean, the Mood Vine, the Botanical Gardens. Pepper added points for the Matchmaking Committee's headquarters, and several affected shops in the market square. As they worked, the cobblestones outside shifted restlessly, creating ripples that spread outward from the market center. "It's like a web," Zinnia realized, tracing the pattern with her finger. The paper beneath her touch tasted of connected dots and hidden pathways. "Oh!" Pepper suddenly shot straight up, her wings freezing mid-buzz. "The deliveries? I can't believe I forgot." The coffee shop's windows began to fog up, as if responding to her agitation. "There's been this figure in a cloak, making rounds when the mist is thickest. Always between 3 and 4 in the morning, when even the insomniacs have given up." The windows grew increasingly opaque, as Pepper described the stranger's fluid movements, and the way they seemed to blend with the shadows. Even the ever-present town mist appeared to press closer to the glass, eager to listen. Zinnia glanced at Thorne, whose natural gloom had deepened thoughtfully. She could taste the reluctant conclusion forming in her mind: bitter medicine and necessary compromises. "We need to work together on this," she said, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "Your knowledge of botanical alchemy and my ability to taste emotional signatures, we might actually have a chance of figuring out what's happening." Thorne nodded slowly, his cloud cover lightening just slightly. "I know we got off to a rough start. You killed my prize vine." "Accidentally," he amended. "But yes, perhaps we can set that aside temporarily? For the good of Whimsica Falls?" Zinnia sighed, tasting practical decisions, and swallowed pride in the back of her throat. "Fine. Partners. Temporarily." As they left the Buzzing Bean, the mood-sensing lamps lining the street flickered and pulsed, trying to interpret the complex emotional cocktail below. Anticipation mixed with apprehension, creating a peculiar mauve glow that painted the misty air in shades Zinnia had never seen before. It tasted like new beginnings and cautious possibilities, with just a hint of tomorrow's uncertainty. The lamps continued their unusual display as she and Thorne parted ways, each step on the nervous cobblestones carrying them deeper into whatever mystery had taken root in their whimsical town. Chapter 4: How to Kill a Cactus in 10 Days. Zinnia inhaled deeply, savoring the complex bouquet of emotions that permeated the Mood Vine's greenhouse. Dawn light filtered through the glass panels, catching on the dew-kissed leaves that rustled with anticipation. Her favorite vintage dress, butter yellow with tiny embroidered flowers, swished around her ankles as she demonstrated proper pruning technique. "The key is to listen to what they're telling you," she explained, running her fingers along a tendril that immediately curled around her wrist like an affectionate bracelet. The vine's leaves shifted to a warm honeyed gold that tasted of contentment and morning sunshine. "See how they respond to gentle attention?" Thorne nodded, his perpetual cloud cover casting shifting shadows across his sharp features. He stood close enough that Zinnia could taste his determination: fresh pencil shavings and new textbooks, but far enough that his gloom wouldn't immediately affect the more sensitive plants. "Your turn," she said, stepping back. "Try that sturdy one there. Cabernet sensitivity, they're usually quite resilient." Thorne approached the vine with the careful movements of someone handling spun glass. His gray fingers barely ghosted over the leaves, but it was enough. A visible wave of melancholy rippled through the plant, its leaves turning ashen and drooping like wet newspaper. The taste of his disappointment hit Zinnia's tongue, rainfall on abandoned gardens, with bitter notes of withered hopes. "I'm hopeless at this," he muttered, withdrawing his hands. "No, you just need practice." Zinnia moved toward the tool rack. "Maybe if we try with the silver pruning shears first." Their hands brushed as they both reached for the tools. The nearest vine exploded into bloom, dozens of pink flowers bursting open like tiny fireworks. Before Zinnia could process this development, Thorne's proximity caused each blossom to wilt and drop, creating a carpet of petals at their feet. They jumped apart, knocking into the carefully organized shelf of emotion-infused fertilizers. Bottles toppled like dominoes, Joy Boost, Serenity Supplement, Passion Plus, their contents mixing on the greenhouse floor in a swirl of sparkles and mist. "I'll get the mop," Thorne said quickly, but Zinnia caught his sleeve. "Wait, first you need to understand what the vines are telling us. The colors are their language." She gestured to the recovering plants around them. "Lavender means contentment, like this one here. Deep blue is melancholy, though we see plenty of that already." She offered a small smile to soften the jab. "Rose means..." The vine nearest to them chose that moment to flush a telling shade of pink. Zinnia's voice faltered as the taste of butterfly wings and first kisses flooded her palate. "Rose means..." Thorne prompted, seemingly oblivious to her flustered state. "Love," she managed, quickly turning away to examine a perfectly healthy plant that absolutely did not need her attention. "It means love." The cleanup effort proved challenging with Thorne's help. Every time he approached with cleaning supplies, another plant would dramatically respond to his gloomy presence. The final straw came when he attempted to water the greenhouse's central tree, a massive, ancient thing that normally stayed above the emotional fray. The moment Thorne's shadow touched its trunk, every single leaf decided autumn had arrived approximately 3 seasons early. They released their hold simultaneously, creating a crackling cascade of foliage that rained down around them like nature's confetti. The tree actually sighed, a sound somewhere between a creaking door and a disappointed parent. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Zinnia muttered, though she couldn't help noticing how Thorne's face scrunched in concentration as he apologized to the tree, how his ever-present cloud cover seemed to thin slightly when he was truly focused on helping. His gloom aura softened around the edges, like fog burning off in morning sun. Catching herself staring, Zinnia quickly busied herself with gathering fallen leaves. But the traitorous vines around her had already picked up on her shifting emotions, their leaves turning various shades of telling magenta. She shot them a betrayed look, and they rustled innocently, as if to say they were simply reporting the facts. "What does magenta mean?" Thorne asked from behind her, and Zinnia nearly jumped out of her skin. "Nothing," she said too quickly. Just the fertilizer mix affecting them. Speaking of which, we should really finish cleaning that up before it starts making the moss write poetry again." She hurried toward the spill, carefully avoiding both Thorne's gaze and the knowing rustle of leaves that followed her retreat. The taste of denied truths and suppressed butterflies lingered on her tongue, and she firmly told herself it was just residual emotion from the plants. Definitely just the plants. After the greenhouse fiasco, Zinnia led Thorne to the tasting room, hoping the more resilient wine bottles might survive his presence better than the living plants. The familiar space, with its exposed brick walls and reclaimed wood shelving, usually brought her comfort. Today it felt charged with an energy she couldn't quite name. "Maybe we should take a breather," she suggested, trying not to notice how the afternoon light caught the silver threads in his perpetually stormy aura. "The wines are already bottled, so they should be safe enough." Famous last words? Thorne's elbow barely grazed the nearest rack as he turned, but it was enough. The bottles shuddered, their contents swirling like miniature whirlpools. Zinnia's heart dropped. Those were her prize vintages, carefully cultivated to capture specific emotional moments. But when she cautiously uncorked one to assess the damage, the taste that hit her tongue wasn't ruined at all. It was extraordinary. Oh, she breathed, letting the flavors bloom across her palate. That's interesting. Where the wine had once tasted of summer picnics and childhood laughter, it now carried deeper notes of reminiscence and sweet melancholy, like watching old home movies on a rainy day. The combination was unexpectedly perfect. Before she could process this discovery, the delivery bell chimed. Outside, a stack of boxes waited, each filled with delicate seedlings for the spring planting. Thorne immediately moved to help, despite her protests. I can manage these, he insisted, lifting a box. They're already in protective. The rest of his sentence was lost as he tripped over absolutely nothing. A talent Zinnia was beginning to suspect he'd perfected. She lunged forward without thinking, catching his arm. The box went flying, sending tiny pots arcing through the air like ceramic fireworks. But Zinnia barely noticed the chaos. Where her hand gripped Thorne's forearm, his ever-present gloom seemed to retreat. The gray clouds thinned, revealing a patch of normal-colored skin beneath. They both stared at the point of contact, frozen in surprise. That's never happened before, Thorne whispered, wonder creeping into his voice. The moment stretched like honey, sweet and slow, until a pot shattered nearby, jolting them back to reality. They scrambled to rescue the scattered seedlings, working together to salvage what they could. As they repotted the survivors, Zinnia noticed something odd. While most plants cowered from Thorne's presence, a few seemed to lean in. The moonflowers particularly appeared to thrive, their silver-edged leaves perking up in his shadow. The night-blooming jasmine actually stretched toward him, its buds swelling with unprecedented vigor. Thorne, look. She grabbed his hand, ignoring the flutter in her stomach as she did so, and guided it toward the moonflower. Instead of wilting, the plant curled toward his touch like a cat seeking attention. The smile that broke across his face transformed him. His perpetual storm clouds seemed to lift slightly, and for a moment Zinnia could taste dawn breaking through midnight and stars emerging after rain. Their success proved short-lived, however. Riding high on their breakthrough, Thorne volunteered to help move some boxes to the cellar. As he passed under the vine-covered archway leading downstairs, his elbow brushed one of the support posts. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The entire archway shuddered as waves of gloom rippled through the vines. Leaves crisped and curled, flowers dropped like tears, and the wooden beams groaned in vegetative distress. The structure sagged dramatically, shedding foliage like a massive green sneeze. They found themselves standing in the aftermath, leaves still drifting down around them like organic confetti. Zinnia became acutely aware of how close they were standing, how she could see individual raindrops suspended in his aura, how his eyes held hints of silver storm clouds. The air grew thick with something that tasted like thunder before rain and honey-sweet anticipation on her tongue. Her heart drummed an uneven rhythm as Thorne's gaze dropped to her lips. Pop! They jumped apart as a nearby wine bottle explosively uncorked itself, sending a geyser of emotion-infused rosé toward the ceiling. The liquid sparkled as it fell, tasting of startled laughter and missed opportunities. As they scrambled for cleaning supplies, Zinnia couldn't help stealing glances at Thorne. More than once, she caught him doing the same, though they both pretended to be completely absorbed in mopping up wine. Neither mentioned how every remaining healthy vine in the room had turned the exact same shade of romantic pink, their leaves quivering with what Zinnia could only taste as suppressed giggles and matchmaking glee. The traitorous plants were clearly taking sides, and subtlety was not their strong suit. Chapter 5: Truth Serum and Other Social Lubricants. The Harvest Moon Festival transformed Market Square into a twilight wonderland, with floating lanterns bobbing like lazy fireflies against the deepening purple sky. Zinnia adjusted her vintage dress. Tonight's choice was a burnished copper that matched the autumn leaves, and surveyed the growing crowd. The mood-sensing lamps pulsed a warm amber, reflecting the collective excitement humming through the cobblestones. Something caught her eye near the refreshment table. The punch bowl's contents shimmered with an unnatural iridescence, like oil on water. As an emotion taster, she'd learned to trust her instincts about suspicious beverages, and this one practically screamed for attention. Before she could investigate further, a familiar presence approached. The festival's warm glow actually seemed to soften Thorne's perpetual storm cloud, turning it into something more like evening mist. He'd made an attempt at festive dress, a dark suit with a harvest gold tie that somehow hadn't wilted in his presence. The combination of moonlight and lantern glow caught the silver in his eyes, and Zinnia found herself staring a moment too long. "You look," he started, then seemed to think better of it. A nearby pumpkin vine curled away from his feet. "Less gloomy than usual?" Zinnia supplied, fighting back a smile. "I was going to say nice, but now I'm questioning my approach." The corner of his mouth twitched upward, and Zinnia's heart did an annoying little skip. A burst of unnatural laughter cut through their moment. Ms. Primrose, the usually stern town librarian, was doubled over by the local history booth, howling with mirth. The books around her fluttered their pages nervously, and one particularly sensitive volume of poetry actually slammed itself shut in protest. "I just realized," Ms. Primrose gasped between fits of giggles, "how absolutely hilarious the Dewey Decimal System is." She collapsed into another round of cackling. Before Zinnia could process this bizarre display, Harold the gardener leapt onto a nearby table. "The chrysanthemums," he declared, normally quiet voice booming across the square. "They speak to my soul." He launched into an impassioned sonnet about root systems and proper mulching techniques. The cobblestones shifted uneasily beneath their feet, and Zinnia grabbed Thorne's arm to steady herself. She noticed the cloud cover around his skin thin slightly at her touch, but there were more pressing matters at hand. "The punch," she said, pulling him toward the refreshment table. "Something's wrong with it." They reached the table just as Jerry, the perpetually cheerful mailman, took a long drink. His smile wavered, then crumpled. "Nobody appreciates hand-delivered mail anymore," he wailed, sinking to his knees. "It's all electronic." He dissolved into heaving sobs. Zinnia picked up a cup of the punch, ignoring Thorne's protest. She had to know what they were dealing with. The liquid swirled unnaturally in the cup, and she took a careful sip. The taste hit her like an emotional freight train. Her face contorted as the flavors assaulted her supernatural senses. Manufactured euphoria crashed against artificial melancholy, creating a nauseating spiral of forced feelings. But underneath, there was something darker, more insidious. It tasted like shadows in a bottle, like laughter with cruel intentions. The nearby wine bottles began to rattle in their crates, responding to the corrupted emotions. Zinnia spat the punch into a napkin, but even that small taste left her feeling dizzy and off balance. "Zinnia?" Thorne's hand was on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly steady. The concern in his voice helped ground her, but the chaos around them was escalating rapidly. "I love you," shouted the baker to a startled lamppost. "I've always loved you." "Everyone stop looking at me," screamed a usually outgoing dance instructor, diving under a table. The town's weather, always sensitive to emotional energy, went haywire. Sunshine broke through the evening clouds for approximately 30 seconds, before being replaced by a sudden downpour. The rain lasted just long enough to soak everyone, before giving way to an unnatural swirling mist that tasted like confusion and artificial hysteria on Zinnia's tongue. "We need to stop people from drinking any more of that punch," she said, steadying herself against Thorne. To her surprise, his perpetual gloom seemed to be acting as a buffer against the emotional chaos, creating a small pocket of calm around them. A crash of thunder punctuated her words, as someone else succumbed to the contaminated drink. The mood-sensing lamps were cycling through colors so quickly they looked like deranged disco balls, and the cobblestones had started rearranging themselves in agitated patterns. "Get back here with my heart," bellowed the normally soft-spoken florist, chasing the confused town blacksmith across the square. Above them, the harvest moon seemed to peek through the clouds with morbid curiosity, as if even it couldn't look away from the unfolding disaster. Zinnia's head spun as she watched the festival descend into emotional chaos. Through the haze of artificial feelings assaulting her senses, she noticed something peculiar. People who stumbled too close to Thorne's gloomy aura actually seemed to settle, their manic energy dampening to more manageable levels. "Your cloud," she grabbed his sleeve, ignoring the little spark that shot through her fingers at the contact. "It's helping." Thorne blinked, looking around as the realization dawned. For once, being a walking rain cloud has its advantages. His perpetual frown lifted slightly, and Zinnia felt an unexpected warmth bloom in her chest. They worked in tandem, guiding affected festival-goers toward Thorne's calming presence. Their hands brushed as they steadied a particularly distraught baker who'd proposed marriage to 3 different inanimate objects. Each accidental touch sent little shivers through Zinnia's already overwhelmed senses, but she couldn't tell if it was Thorne's effect or just the general emotional mayhem in the air. While helping Mrs. Henderson down from where she'd been attempting to conduct an invisible orchestra atop a pickle barrel, Zinnia caught sight of something in the punch bowl. Her stomach dropped. There, stuck to the crystal rim, was a fragment of label with that same mysteriously fading text she'd seen on the suspicious coffee shop deliveries. A movement in her peripheral vision drew her attention to the falls in the distance. The usually pristine waters had taken on an unsettling metallic sheen, like liquid mercury under the harvest moon. The sight made her tongue tingle with phantom tastes of artificial melancholy and manufactured joy. "Thorne," she called out, but before she could explain, a glass bottle rolled out from under the refreshment table's rumpled cloth. It clinked against her shoe, the sound somehow ominous despite the surrounding cacophony. The bottle bore an elaborate seal, an intertwined V and N surrounded by alchemical symbols. "That's Vector's mark," Thorne said, kneeling beside her. "I see it on all the botanical enhancement orders at the garden." He picked up the bottle carefully, and Zinnia's supernatural senses recoiled. The glass practically radiated corrupted emotions, like a perfume made of broken promises and forced smiles. A familiar buzzing filled the air, and Pepper zipped into view, her wings a blur of agitation. "Oh my gardenias, you'll never believe what I saw." The sprite's usual gossip-fueled energy was tinged with genuine concern. Vector was skulking around the supply area earlier, wearing this ridiculous cloak. And not the fashionable kind of ridiculous, the suspicious kind. The nearby gossip-loving ferns rustled enthusiastically, their leaves shivering in confirmation. Zinnia had learned long ago that plants were surprisingly reliable witnesses, especially the nosier varieties. "He was mixing something into bottles," Pepper continued, her wings creating little eddies in Thorne's gloom cloud. "And muttering about emotional enhancement and showing them all what real feelings taste like." She made air quotes with her tiny hands, nearly spinning herself in a circle with the gesture. Before Zinnia could process this information, the mood-sensing lamps suddenly flared a violent crimson. Another wave of emotional chaos swept through the crowd, like a tsunami of feelings. The force of it hit Zinnia full force. Manufactured grief crashed against artificial euphoria, while synthetic rage swirled with counterfeit serenity. Her knees buckled under the assault of tastes that shouldn't exist. Strong arms caught her before she could fall. Thorne's perpetual gloom enveloped her like a protective blanket, muting the overwhelming sensations. She found herself leaning into his chest, surprised by how comforting his natural melancholy felt compared to the artificial emotional storm raging around them. "I've got you," he murmured, and Zinnia felt the vibration of his words through his chest. His cloud cover thinned slightly where she touched him, and for a moment she could have sworn she tasted a hint of genuine concern beneath his usual gloom. Movement in the shadows caught her attention. Vector stood at the edge of the festival, his dark cloak swirling with what looked like bottled emotions, little vials of shifting colors that clinked together with each movement. The sight made Zinnia's supernatural senses scream in warning. This was wrong, all wrong. Emotions weren't meant to be bottled and mixed like common potions. She pushed away from Thorne's steadying embrace, ready to confront Vector, but the emotion alchemist was already melting into the gathering mist. He vanished between one breath and the next, leaving behind only the metallic taste of artificial feelings on Zinnia's tongue, and the unsettling knowledge that this was far from over. The harvest moon hung above them like a concerned spectator, its light catching the unnatural sheen that still colored the falls. Around them, the festival continued its descent into chaos, but now there was something more sinister about it, the knowledge that this wasn't just an accident, but the beginning of something deliberately set in motion. Thorne's hand found hers in the chaos, his touch grounding her against the swirl of manufactured emotions. "We need to stop him," he said simply, his natural gloom creating a pocket of clarity in the emotional storm. Chapter 6: The Great Grape Depression. Zinnia's fingers trembled as she traced the master vine's withering tendril. Dawn had barely broken over the mood vine, but the sickly gray tinge of the leaves was unmistakable even in the dim light. She pressed her tongue to the roof of her mouth, tasting the air. Fading magic whispered across her palate, followed by an ancient sorrow that made her throat tight. "Please, please, please," she whispered, pressing her hand against the vine's trunk. The emotional pulse that had guided generations of truth-telling wine barely flickered beneath her touch. Around her, bottles of carefully crafted vintage began to lose their distinctive emotional signatures, their contents turning flat and lifeless. The crunch of footsteps on gravel announced Thorne's arrival. "I came as soon as I felt the magical disturbance," he said, his perpetual cloud of gloom actually lighter than the darkness emanating from the dying vine. "It started sometime during the night," Zinnia said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "The master vine has never, it's been here since before the town was founded." She swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. Thorne knelt beside her, his long fingers gentle as they examined a cluster of graying leaves. "The cellular structure is breaking down, but not from natural causes." His cloud darkened with concentration. "This is deliberate." A sudden crack of thunder made them both jump. Through the vineyard's windows, Zinnia watched sunshine give way to storm clouds in the space of heartbeats, only to clear again moments later. The falls visible in the distance had turned a murky brown, like tea left steeping too long. "The town's whole magical ecosystem is destabilizing," Thorne murmured. "The master vine must be more connected to Whimsica Falls' magical infrastructure than anyone realized." The mood-sensing lamps flickered wildly, cycling through colors faster than Zinnia could process the emotions they represented. "The cellar," she said suddenly. "My great-grandmother kept records of everything about the master vine. There might be something." They descended into the cool darkness of the wine cellar, where generations of vintners had stored their craft. Zinnia pulled out crumbling leather-bound journals, while Thorne conjured a small globe of muted light that hung above their heads. "Here," she said, spreading the books across an old oak table. Their shoulders brushed as they leaned over the faded text, and nearby wine bottles began to hum softly. Zinnia glanced up to see their contents swirling with rose-gold hues. She quickly looked back down at the pages, her cheeks warming. Thorne's finger traced a line of text. "Look at this description of a blight that affected the vine in 1922. The symptoms are different, but the magical signature." He pulled out a notebook where he documented the garden's recent cases of emotional tampering. Their eyes met over the books, and Zinnia's breath caught. She could taste the moment on her tongue, revelation tinged with something warmer like sunlight through honey. Thorne's eternal cloud of gloom thinned slightly where it swirled between them. "The contamination pattern is identical," he said softly, still holding her gaze. "Vector isn't just tampering with individual drinks, he's trying to corrupt the source." "We need samples," Zinnia said, reluctantly breaking the moment. "If we can isolate the magical compound he's using." They returned to the dying vine, collection vials in hand. As Zinnia reached for a leaf sample, her fingers brushed against Thorne's. Instead of pulling away, she found herself noticing how his ever-present melancholy had shifted. What had once felt oppressive now reminded her of cool shade on a sweltering day, a refuge rather than a burden. Around them, the surviving vines turned a deep, rich purple, the color of secrets shared in twilight. Zinnia pretended not to notice, just as she pretended not to notice how Thorne's cloud had developed a slight silver lining where it curled around her shoulders. She focused instead on collecting samples, trying to ignore how the master vine's fading pulse echoed the uncertain flutter of her own heart. The morning light filtered through the unstable weather outside, casting strange shadows across Thorne's face as he worked beside her in comfortable silence. The master vine shuddered beneath Zinnia's fingers, and before she could pull away, a wave of raw emotion slammed into her with the force of a tsunami. Her knees buckled as centuries of stored feelings crashed through her emotional defenses, first loves and last goodbyes, midnight confessions and dawn revelations, every truth ever whispered over glasses of enchanted wine. She reached blindly for support and found Thorne's arms around her, his own balance wavering as the emotional surge washed over them both. They sank to the ground together, and Zinnia's senses overloaded with the taste of 1,000 memories, sweet joy mixing with bitter regret, the sharp tang of anger dissolving into the mellow notes of forgiveness. When the wave finally receded, Zinnia found herself clutching Thorne's shirt, their faces mere inches apart. His eternal cloud of gloom had thinned to a translucent mist, where it mingled with her quick, shaky breaths. She could taste his intention to withdraw before he even moved, the familiar flavor of self-imposed isolation bitter on her tongue. "Don't," she whispered, catching his hand as he tried to pull away. The air around them thickened, heavy with possibility and magic. Sometimes the most honest feelings taste bittersweet. The atmosphere shifted, filling her senses with rain-soaked roses and distant thunder. Thorne's fingers trembled against hers, his perpetual melancholy wavering like a candle in the wind. Through her gift, Zinnia tasted his struggle, the yearning to stay warring with his instinct to protect her from his nature. She didn't consciously decide to kiss him. One moment she was reading the complex emotions in the air, and the next her lips were pressed against his. Magic crackled around them like static electricity, making her hair float and sending sparks dancing across their skin. The master vine gave a faint musical hum, and Zinnia tasted hope, bright and clean as morning dew. For one perfect breath, Thorne's gloom lifted entirely. Zinnia saw him clearly in the golden light that streamed through the vineyard windows, saw the wonder in his gray eyes, the slight upturn of his lips, the way his shoulders relaxed as if setting down a heavy burden. Then everything went wrong. The gloom surged back with devastating force, darker and heavier than she'd ever sensed it. Potted herbs on nearby shelves crumpled as if struck by frost. The climbing vines that decorated the tasting room's walls blackened and peeled away. Even the ancient master vine recoiled, its leaves curling inward like frightened fingers. Zinnia's gift bombarded her with the emotional aftermath. Hope curdled into despair, leaving an ashy residue on her tongue. Longing wound through it all like a copper wire, sharp and metallic. Fear tasted like green tea steeped too long, bitter and astringent. But underneath everything else lay the muddy flavor of self-doubt, so strong it made her eyes water. "I'm sorry," Thorne choked out, backing away. His cloud of gloom followed, leaving trails of withered plants in his wake. The herbs she'd spent months nurturing dropped their leaves like autumn had come early. The decorative flowering vines that had taken years to train along the walls crumbled to dust. Zinnia stood rooted in place, surrounded by the botanical casualties of their kiss. Through her gift, she tasted the truth that Thorne couldn't speak. His gloom intensified not because he'd lost control, but because he was fighting so hard to contain it. To protect her. The harder he tried to hold back his nature, the more it leaked out around the edges, like water through cupped hands. Outside the windows, the falls shifted color, turning the exact shade of a heartbreaking. Not the bright red of fresh pain, but the deep complex purple of an old bruise. Zinnia pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the echo of Thorne's retreat in the magical atmosphere around her. Even the air tasted like goodbye. They stood at opposite ends of the room, a graveyard of withered plants between them. Thorne's cloud had grown so dark she could barely make out his expression, but she didn't need to see his face. The taste of his regret filled the room like smoke, making her eyes sting and her throat tight. The master vine gave another weak pulse, and Zinnia caught a fleeting impression of centuries of similar moments, joy and sorrow tangled together like roots, love and loss as interwoven as the vine's own branches. The taste lingered on her tongue, bittersweet, complex, and absolutely true. Chapter 7, 50 Shades of Gloom. Zinnia arrived at the botanical gardens early the next morning, following an urgent text from Pepper about absolute chaos unfolding. The moment she stepped inside, she tasted ozone and artificial sunshine, a combination that made her nose wrinkle. The magical atmosphere felt like drinking orange juice after brushing your teeth. Through the Victorian-style glass panels, she spotted Marigold chasing Thorne with what appeared to be a weaponized parasol. Golden rays shot from its frilly edges while Thorne dodged, his personal rain cloud growing darker by the second. "Hold still," Marigold called out, her solar witch aura blazing. "This concentrated sunbeam therapy is guaranteed to perk up even the gloomiest fairy." "I respectfully decline," Thorne replied, ducking behind a large fern. The plant immediately shuddered and began gossiping to its neighbors in rustling whispers. The rain cloud above Thorne suddenly quadrupled in size, releasing a deluge that had the gossiping ferns shrieking in vegetative scandal. Zinnia pressed her lips together, tasting the complex blend of Thorne's mortification, bitter chocolate, Marigold's determination, spicy cinnamon, and the fern's dramatic outrage, cucumber water with too much cucumber. By the time Zinnia reached them, Marigold had somehow managed to wrap Thorne in no less than 5 enchanted scarves. Each one glowed a different neon shade and warbled cheerful show tunes in clashing keys. The overall effect was like a magical Broadway disaster. "Zippity-doo-dah," screeched a particularly enthusiastic yellow scarf, while a purple one attempted to harmonize with "The Hills Are Alive." Thorne met Zinnia's gaze with an expression of such profound suffering that she had to bite her cheek to keep from laughing. A nearby patch of dormant daisies suddenly burst into bloom, picking up on her suppressed amusement. "Zinnia?" Marigold beamed. "Perfect timing. Wait until you see my latest innovation, the Joy Junction." Before either of them could protest, Marigold unveiled what looked like a cross between a disco ball and a mad scientist's fever dream. Crystals of various sizes were arranged in a complex geometric pattern, with mirrors positioned at precise angles between them. The crystals amplify positive energy, while the mirrors reflect it back exponentially, Marigold explained, practically vibrating with excitement. "It's foolproof." Zinnia's empathic senses screamed danger a split second before everything went spectacularly wrong. The crystals lit up like a magical circuit overloading, and suddenly the air tasted like a fireworks display in a candy shop. Rainbow-colored energy exploded outward, filling the greenhouse with prismatic chaos. When the light show finally died down, Zinnia found herself staring at Thorne, whose usually sleek black hair now stood straight up, crackling with static electricity. Her own hair probably looked no better, judging by Marigold's unsuccessful attempt to suppress her giggles. Later, while Marigold went to fetch what she called her backup sunshine solution, Zinnia and Thorne huddled over a stack of delivery receipts from Pepper's coffee shop. Their shoulders brushed as they leaned in to examine a suspicious pattern of late-night deliveries. "These ingredients," Zinnia murmured, "they're all emotion amplifiers." She could practically taste the residual magic on the paper, sharp and artificial, like laboratory-created flavoring, trying to pass as natural. A cluster of forget-me-nots on the nearby desk suddenly bloomed and wilted in rapid succession as their arms touched again. Neither of them acknowledged it, though Zinnia noticed Thorne shift slightly closer rather than pull away. Their research was interrupted by Marigold's return. This time, her attempt to infuse Thorne with solar optimism involved what looked suspiciously like a garden sprayer filled with liquid sunshine. The resulting magical reaction caused Thorne's rain cloud to reshape itself into a distinctly gloomy smiley face, complete with dripping eyes that created puddles on the floor. Zinnia's gift caught the complex emotions in the air, frustration layered with resignation, and underneath it all, a thread of genuine appreciation for Marigold's well-meaning efforts. The combination tasted like dark chocolate with sea salt, bittersweet but somehow perfect. As evening approached, they followed their leads to an abandoned shop on the edge of town. The moment they stepped inside, Zinnia's senses were overwhelmed by the magical residue in the air. It tasted like bottled storms and artificial sunshine, with undertones of metallic emotion that made her head spin. "There's something behind this wall," she whispered, pressing her hand against a section of apparently solid brick. The magical flavors were stronger here, seeping through invisible cracks. Thorne stepped closer, his perpetual gloom spreading to fill the shadows of the room. Instead of hindering their investigation, the darkness actually helped conceal them, creating a perfect cover as they searched for Vector's hidden lab entrance. "The darkness tastes different around you," Zinnia found herself saying. "Natural. Like night-blooming jasmine and summer storms." Nothing like these artificial emotions Vector's been brewing. She felt rather than saw Thorne's surprise, his gloom cloud lightening just slightly around the edges. Before he could respond, her fingers found a loose brick, and the false wall began to move. The false wall swung open with an ominous creak, revealing Vector's hidden laboratory. Zinnia's empathic senses immediately went haywire. The air tasted like 1,000 bottled emotions had been uncorked at once: artificial joy that burned like pop rocks dipped in battery acid, synthetic melancholy that coated her tongue like stale coffee grounds, and manufactured love that was sickeningly sweet like gas station perfume. This is, she pressed a hand to her temple, steadying herself against the assault of flavors. Glass vials lined the walls in neat rows, each containing swirling essences of different colors. It's overwhelming. These aren't natural emotions, they're copies, corrupted versions. Thorne moved closer, his natural gloom providing an oddly grounding presence. His darkness tasted clean compared to the chemical cocktails surrounding them. These distillation units, he gestured to complex glass apparatus that wouldn't have looked out of place in a mad scientist's lab, they're similar to what we use for extracting plant essences in the gardens. But these have been modified. Zinnia approached a workbench covered in journals and loose papers, trying to ignore the taste of crystallized tears that lingered in the air. Vector's precise handwriting filled page after page with alchemical formulas and emotional equations. Her stomach turned as she read descriptions of harvesting pure grief and synthesizing artificial ecstasy. "Look at this," Thorne said, pointing to a diagram. "He's using nightshade variants to stabilize the mixtures. That's why the plants in the garden have been acting strange. He's been harvesting them for components." A sudden noise from the corridor had them both freezing. Footsteps approached, accompanied by the distinctive taste of Vector's aura, sharp and metallic, like biting down on aluminum foil. Without thinking, Zinnia grabbed Thorne's arm and pulled him into a nearby storage closet. The space was barely big enough for one person, let alone two. Zinnia found herself pressed against Thorne's chest, his personal rain cloud wrapping around them like a protective cocoon. She could feel his heartbeat, steady despite their predicament. His gloom, rather than exposing them, actually helped conceal their presence, darkening the shadows around them until they were practically invisible. Vector's footsteps passed directly outside their hiding spot. Zinnia held her breath, hyper-aware of every point of contact between her body and Thorne's. His natural emotional signature tasted like thunder and mint, drowning out the artificial flavors that permeated the lab. Once Vector moved away, they slipped out of the closet and quickly gathered what evidence they could before retreating to the safety of the botanical gardens. However, their relief was short-lived. "There you are." Marigold's cheerful voice rang out across the greenhouse. "I've finally perfected it, the ultimate mood enhancer." Before either of them could protest, she produced a bottle of shimmering pink liquid and spritzed it directly at Thorne. His perpetual rain cloud immediately turned a shocking shade of cotton candy pink. "Oh no," Thorne said, then looked horrified as he continued in perfect rhythm. "This spell makes me speak in rhyme, causing chaos every time." Zinnia nearly choked on the taste of his mortification. Embarrassed strawberries and summer rain with a hint of thunder. The combination shouldn't have worked, but somehow it did. "I'll leave you to enjoy the effects," Marigold called out as she practically skipped away. "It should only last an hour or 3. "This curse is worse than I could fear," Thorne groaned melodically. "Please tell me you have wine down here." They spread Vector's stolen journals across a workbench, trying to focus despite Thorne's poetic predicament. Zinnia's finger traced a particularly complex formula, and her hand brushed against Thorne's. Instead of pulling away, he let their hands remain touching, and something extraordinary happened. The plants nearest to them seemed caught between Thorne's influence and the spark of connection between them. A vine simultaneously produced new growth, while its older leaves withered, creating a strange but beautiful pattern of death and rebirth. It was as if the plants were finding their own balance, much like they were. "These formulas," Zinnia said, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand rather than the warmth of Thorne's hand near hers, "they're all building to something bigger. Look at how he references the master vine in every calculation." A plan most foul does Vector make, Thorne replied in verse, then closed his eyes in obvious pain at having to continue. The master vine he means to take. Zinnia spread out more pages, the pieces clicking into place. He's not just creating emotion cocktails for fun, he's developing a way to corrupt the master vine itself. If he succeeds, the town's emotional core he'll steal, Thorne rhymed grimly, and all our feelings he can steal. From somewhere in the garden, they could hear Marigold humming while hanging what sounded like wind chimes. Oh, these enchanted chimes will be perfect, her voice drifted over. And wait until you see the motivational butterflies I've bred. Their wing patterns spell out inspirational quotes. Thorne's pink cloud darkened slightly as he muttered in perfect iambic pentameter. Tomorrow brings fresh torments, this I know, as Marigold continues with her show. Chapter 8, Buzzed and Confused. Zinnia hurried through the twilight streets of Whimsica Falls, her heels clicking against the cobblestones. The emergency wine tasting text from Pepper had seemed suspicious, but duty called. As she approached the buzzing bean, she stopped short, her empathic senses overwhelmed by the emotional atmosphere wafting through the windows. Cotton candy conspiracy. Caffeinated Cupid arrows. And was that matchmaking mischief with hints of vanilla? Oh no. The coffee shop had transformed into something out of a fairy tale romance. Dozens of candles floated near the ceiling, casting a warm golden glow. Self-playing violins hovered in the corners, their bows drawing out sweet melodies that tasted like honey and first kisses. The usual mismatched chairs had been replaced with intimate tables for two, each decorated with roses that sparkled with dew. There you are. Pepper's wings hummed with barely contained excitement as she zipped over. Her sprite-sized apron was covered in glitter, and she practically vibrated with anticipation. Emergency wine tasting. Very serious business. Pepper. Zinnia started, but was cut off by the sound of spoons tapping against coffee cups in perfect rhythm with her heartbeat. The barista's matchmaking intentions were so strong, they practically gave her a sugar rush. The bell above the door chimed, and Zinnia's stomach did a backflip as Thorne stepped in, looking bewildered. His perpetual rain cloud immediately snuffed out half the floating candles, creating pools of shadow that somehow made the remaining lights seem even more romantic. I was told there was an urgent botanical. Thorne's voice trailed off as he took in the scene. Behind him, Pepper darted to the door, turning the lock with an exaggerated click. Oh look, you're both here. What a complete surprise. Pepper's wings buzzed with delight. Well, now that you are, you simply must try my new evening menu. 7 courses of magical mood-enhancing beverages. The first course arrived via floating tray, 2 cups of something that shimmered like liquid moonlight. Zinnia could taste the emotional resonance before it even touched her lips, hints of first-date butterflies and nervous anticipation. This is ridiculous, Thorne muttered, but sat down across from her anyway. His cloud drizzled lightly, creating tiny rainbows in the candlelight. By the third course, sweetheart sigh syrup in delicate crystal glasses, Zinnia found herself relaxing despite herself. The awkwardness began to fade, replaced by genuine conversation about their investigation. Thorne's rhyming curse had finally worn off, much to his relief. At least Marigold's given up on the motivational butterflies, he said, almost smiling. One kept landing on my nose, spelling out, dance like nobody's watching. Zinnia laughed, and nearby flowers bloomed in response to her joy. The moment their eyes met, their drinks transformed into perfect hearts, complete with tiny Cupid arrows made of foam. The love at first sip latte, Pepper announced proudly, zooming past with another tray. My masterpiece. Thorne's anxiety spiked at that, tasting like bitter almonds and rain. The enchanted violins picked up on his mood, their cheerful melody transforming into something more suited to a gothic romance. The wedding march became a funeral dirge. I'm sorry, he said, his cloud darkening. I'm ruining everything, as usual. You're not, Zinnia assured him, reaching across the table. Their fingers brushed, sending a spark of electricity through her that tasted like lightning and possibility. A movement outside the window caught her attention. Vector Nightshade skulked past, his emotional signature sharp and metallic against the sweet atmosphere of the coffee shop. He carried something that looked suspiciously like potion-making equipment. "We need to follow him," Zinnia whispered, standing up. Thorne nodded, already moving toward the door. "Oh no you don't," Pepper called out. "The evening's not over." They found themselves suddenly entangled in enchanted streamers that seemed to have a mind of their own. The more they struggled, the more the decorations wrapped around them, pulling them closer together, until Zinnia found herself pressed against Thorne's chest for the second time that day. "Pepper, this is serious," Zinnia protested, trying to ignore how nice Thorne's rain cloud felt as it wrapped around them both. "Vector's up to something." "The streamers will release you after dessert," Pepper said firmly, producing what appeared to be a chocolate souffle that sparkled like the night sky. "Which will be served in exactly 20 minutes. "We don't have 20 minutes, Thorne growled, his frustration causing the violins to switch to an aggressive tango. He tried to move away from Zinnia, but the streamers simply pulled them closer. "Stop struggling," Zinnia advised, very aware of every point of contact between them. "You're just making them more determined." A tendril of streamer booped Thorne on the nose, as if agreeing with her. His expression of indignant surprise was so adorable that Zinnia couldn't help but laugh, which only encouraged the decorations further. They found themselves being waltzed around the coffee shop by Pepper's enthusiastic enchantments, while the violins switched yet again to something that sounded suspiciously like, "Can you feel the love tonight?" "I suppose," Thorne said carefully, his cloud now more of a gentle mist, "we could wait until Vector reaches his destination. Better to catch him in the act." "Exactly," Zinnia agreed, trying not to focus on how well they fit together, or how his emotional signature had shifted from anxiety to something warmer, like summer rain on roses. Tactical decision. Very professional. The streamers seemed to approve, loosening just enough to let them breathe while maintaining their close proximity. Through the window, they could see Vector disappearing around a corner, but for the moment, neither of them moved to follow. Zinnia stumbled as the enchanted streamers finally released their grip, sending both her and Thorne sprawling onto the buzzing beans hardwood floor. Around them, flowers drooped in Thorne's presence, and scattered petals from Pepper's decorations swirled like confetti in his gloomy breeze. "Vector's getting away," Zinnia said, scrambling to her feet. She could still taste the metallic tang of his emotional signature in the air, sharp and artificial against the sweet remnants of Pepper's romantic atmosphere. They burst out of the coffee shop, only to find their hands magnetically drawn together the moment they got within arm's reach. Zinnia felt her cheeks flush. "Pepper's spell." "Still active," Thorne finished, his cloud drizzling in embarrassment. "Sorry." They hurried through Whimsica's twilight streets, trying to maintain enough distance to avoid the spell's effects while keeping Vector in sight. His dark figure moved purposefully through the mist, carrying what looked like ancient alchemical equipment. The chase led them toward the falls, where the usual spectral lights danced with unusual intensity. Vector stopped at an old stone well, its moss-covered sides etched with worn runes that seemed to pulse in time with the waterfall's rhythm. Zinnia's empathic senses exploded with sensation as Vector lowered a crystal vial into the well. The water he drew up tasted of raw, unfiltered emotion, joy and sorrow, love and anger, all swirling together in their purest form. The falls themselves responded, their colors shifting rapidly through the spectrum. "Quick hide," Zinnia whispered as Vector turned their way. The only cover nearby was a massive bioluminescent mushroom, its cap easily 5 feet across. They ducked behind it, but the space was tight, forcing them close together. Thorne's perpetual cloud enveloped them both, and Zinnia held her breath, expecting the mushroom to shrivel and die. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The mushroom's glow dimmed slightly, adapting to the gloom rather than fighting it. Other nearby plants seemed to do the same, their colors muting but remaining very much alive. Zinnia felt Thorne's surprise ripple through his emotional signature, like thunder through storm clouds. Vector began his work, mixing the well water with various colored potions. Each combination created new emotional signatures that made Zinnia's head spin. "This is different from his other formulas," she whispered, pressing closer to Thorne to get a better view. more concentrated, more volatile. The mixture in his vial crackled with contained energy, tasting like lightning in chaos and wild summer storms. A warm tingle ran up her arm, and she realized they'd accidentally touched again. Pepper's spell activated instantly, and the flowers around them responded with enthusiasm, bursting into sudden explosive bloom. Pink petals rained down around their hiding spot. Vector's head snapped up at the sound. Zinnia froze, but Thorne's cloud thickened protectively around them, creating perfect camouflage in the growing darkness. The emotional alchemist peered in their direction for a long moment, before returning to his work, muttering calculations under his breath. They watched him fill several more vials, before finally packing up his equipment and heading back toward town. Only when his footsteps had completely faded, did Zinnia dare to move, her joints stiff from holding still for so long. "We should get samples," she said, moving toward the well. Evidence of what ease, she stumbled over a root, and Thorne caught her automatically. The spell yanked their hands together once again, and this time neither of them immediately pulled away. "The plants," Thorne said softly, looking around at the still living vegetation surrounding them. "They're not dying." "Maybe they're learning to adapt to you," Zinnia suggested, trying to ignore how natural his hand felt in hers. "Like I have." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility, until a distant clock tower reminded them of their mission. They collected water samples and documented the scene, carefully avoiding contact to prevent any more magical matchmaking mishaps. When they finally returned to the buzzing bean, they found Pepper hovering anxiously by the door. The sprite had somehow managed to cover every surface with glittering banners proclaiming, "Congratulations on your true love," and "Just kissed." Hearts floated near the ceiling, and the self-playing violins had prepared what sounded like a romantic ballad. Pepper's expression fell as she took in their disheveled appearance, clothes dirty, leaves in their hair, and clutching evidence vials instead of each other. The violins immediately switched to a mournful rendition of "All by Myself," their bows drooping in disappointment. "You're covered in dirt," Pepper said accusingly, her wings drooping. "That's not romantic at all. What happened to my perfect evening?" "Vector happened," Zinnia explained, holding up a vial of the well water. "We found him, collecting emotional essences by the falls. He's planning something big, Pepper. Something dangerous." The sprite sighed dramatically, and the floating hearts began to pop like soap bubbles. "Fine. But next time? Less investigating, more kissing." Chapter 9, Love on the Rocks with a Twist. Zinnia adjusted the last wine glass on the terrace table, angling it to catch the sunset's golden rays. The master vine, draped elegantly across the pergola, managed a soft phosphorescent glow despite its weakened state. She inhaled deeply, tasting the evening air. Anticipation sparkled on her tongue like champagne bubbles mixed with honey, sweet hopes, and just a hint of nervous energy. She'd chosen the wines carefully: a moonflower rosé that sang of summer dreams, a midnight berry red that whispered secrets, and her special reserve of starlight Chardonnay. The crystal decanters caught the fading light, sending prismatic patterns dancing across the weathered wood of the table. Her empathic senses tingled as Thorne approached. His signature cloud of gloom had softened somehow, less thunderstorm and more twilight mist. He rounded the corner carrying a bouquet of night-blooming jasmine and lunar lilies, their silvery petals actually perking up in his presence. "They're the only ones that don't die on me," he said, offering the flowers with an apologetic half-smile. "Though I suspect they might be slightly morbid by nature." "They're perfect," Zinnia said, breathing in their moonlight and midnight fragrance. The blooms seemed to pulse gently in harmony with Thorne's aura, creating an ethereal effect that complemented the vineyard's fairy lights perfectly. She poured the first wine, a delicate violet-tinted vintage that normally tasted of joy and gentle memories. As Thorne's presence settled over the terrace, something extraordinary happened. The wine's emotional notes shifted, deepening and complexifying. What was once simply sweet now carried undertones of wistful beauty, like starlight filtering through storm clouds. "This is fascinating," Zinnia said, swirling her glass. "Your energy, it's actually enhancing the complexity." adding layers I've never tasted before. Thorne looked startled. You mean I'm not ruining it? Far from it. Try the Moonflower Rosé. Their fingers brushed as she handed him the glass, sending a warm tingle up her arm that had nothing to do with Pepper's lingering matchmaking spell. The wine's signature shifted again in his presence, developing notes of midnight gardens and secret wishes. They fell into an easy rhythm of tasting and talking. Thorne described his latest attempts at garden rehabilitation, complete with self-deprecating humor about the great succulent disaster of last Tuesday. When Zinnia shared stories about her first attempts at emotion-tasting wines, his laugh rang out genuine and deep. The nearby vines responded immediately, but not in their usual withering way. Instead, they created an intricate pattern, some branches dimming while others brightened, weaving shadow and light into something mesmerizing. The effect rippled through the vineyard, transforming the entire terrace into a living artwork of darkness and illumination. Look, Zinnia breathed, reaching for his hand. It's beautiful. Thorne stared at the display, wonder replacing his usual careful restraint. I've never seen them do that before. The master vine above them gave an approving shimmer, its glow strengthening slightly. Zinnia felt the shift in Thorne's emotional signature, the perpetual storm clouds parting to reveal something warmer, something that tasted like hope and possibility. He turned toward her, and the air between them grew charged with unspoken words. Zinnia leaned in, tasting anticipation and thunder-sweet tension on her tongue. A scream shattered the moment. The mood-sensing lamps along Market Square suddenly flashed violent colors: crimson rage, toxic yellow hysteria, electric blue mania. The falls visible in the distance blazed an unnatural green that sent Zinnia's empathic senses reeling. The taste hit her like a tidal wave, artificial euphoria and manufactured rage, all twisted together in a nauseating cocktail. Vector, they said in unison, already moving. They sprinted into town, following the sounds of chaos. The scene in Market Square stopped them short. Mrs. Bramble, the usually reserved librarian, was dancing on tables outside the Buzzing Bean, throwing books into the air while laughing manically. Outside the bakery, Mr. Sweetroll sat in a pile of ruined sourdough, sobbing uncontrollably while covered in flour. The fountain at the square's center spewed water in unnatural colors, its spray tasting of concentrated emotional essences. Vector had done it. He'd contaminated the town's water supply with his artificial cocktails. The whole town's water system connects through here, Zinnia said, her empathic senses overwhelmed by the barrage of manufactured feelings. We have to shut it down, before. A group of teenagers ran past, alternating between hysterical laughter and rage-filled shouting. The mood lamps above the square strobed wildly, reflecting the emotional chaos below. Through it all, Zinnia could taste Vector's signature in the contaminated water, bitter and artificial, like chemical sweetener trying to pass as honey. Zinnia's empathic senses reeled as she surveyed the chaos in Market Square. The manufactured emotions tasted sharp and artificial on her tongue, like plastic trying to mimic silk. She turned to Thorne, already formulating a plan. We need to contain this before it spreads further, she said. Your natural dampening effect, it might help neutralize the worst of it. Thorne nodded, his perpetual cloud cover extending outward. Where it touched the contaminated fountain spray, the unnatural colors dimmed slightly. Zinnia moved through the crowd, her ability letting her quickly identify those most affected by Vector's emotional cocktail. Mrs. Bramble, over here, she called, guiding the dancing librarian toward Thorne's calming influence. The woman's manic energy settled as she passed through the gentle gloom, her shoulders dropping as artificial euphoria gave way to confusion. They fell into an efficient rhythm. Zinnia identified and directed affected townspeople, while Thorne's aura helped neutralize the artificial emotions. Several people commented on their seamless teamwork, but Zinnia barely registered the praise, focused on the task at hand. A high-pitched shriek drew her attention to the playground. A group of children, clearly affected by the contaminated water, bounced off playground equipment with dangerous enthusiasm. Their emotional signatures tasted like sugar-rushed lightning. Before Zinnia could move, Thorne's cloud expanded, releasing a gentle shower of sparkling drops over the playground. The children stopped, entranced by the ethereal rain. Their manufactured hysteria mellowed into wonder as they tried to catch the glittering droplets. For a brief moment, Zinnia saw Thorne's face light up with possibility, until he noticed the rain pooling around a flower bed. The cheerful marigolds wilted instantly, their petals turning black. His expression shuddered, cloud-covered darkening noticeably. As the initial crisis subsided, Zinnia coordinated with town officials to shut off the main water supply. She moved confidently through the crowd, using her ability to identify lingering effects and recommend treatment. But she felt Thorne's emotional signature growing increasingly distant, like thunder moving away across dark waters. Every time his presence accidentally affected nearby plants, window boxes shriveling, hanging baskets drooping, his mood darkened further. The mood-sensing lamps picked up his growing melancholy, casting long shadows across the square that had nothing to do with the setting sun. When the immediate danger passed, they made their way back to the vineyard terrace. Their carefully planned evening lay in ruins. Zinnia picked up a wine glass, only to find the contents transformed to vinegar, sharp and sour on her tongue. Thorne's intensified gloom had affected every bottle, turning their perfect sunset tasting into an acidic reminder of failure. His emotional signature tasted of defeat, bitter herbs and cold ashes, with an underlying note she recognized all too well. It was the taste of goodbye. "Thorne," she said softly, reaching for his hand. He stepped back, his cloud-covered darkening until he was barely visible within its shadows. "I can't do this to you, Zinnia. Everything I touch turns to disaster. The plants, the wine, your entire life revolves around things I destroy just by existing." The carefully tended vines around the terrace withered and blackened, their leaves curling inward like dying butterflies. Zinnia watched helplessly, as weeks of growth disappeared in seconds. "That's not true," she started, but he cut her off with a gesture. "Look around. I'm nothing but a curse. You deserve someone who brings light to your life, not endless shadows." Before she could argue, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the evening mist that seemed to rise up specifically to claim him. Zinnia stood alone on the terrace, surrounded by withered vines and sour wine. Above her, the master vine stirred. A single drop of wine formed on one of its remaining healthy clusters, falling into an untouched glass with perfect precision. Zinnia lifted it to her lips, tasting rain-soaked hope layered with bittersweet longing, their emotions perfectly preserved in liquid form. In the distance, the falls shifted color, its waters now glowing with the exact shade of heartache, a deep purple tinged with midnight blue, the color of storms that haven't yet learned how to break. Chapter 10: How to Save a Wine and Die Trying. Thorne stared at the master vine through the pre-dawn gloom, his heart sinking as the last silvery leaf crumbled between his fingers. The ancient plant had turned the color of wet ashes, its once vibrant branches now brittle and lifeless. Around him, Whimsica Falls seemed to stutter like a skipping record. The enchanted lampposts flickered erratically, casting strange shadows across the cobblestones. "It's worse than I feared." Zinnia's voice carried from the doorway of the mood vine. She moved closer, her vintage dress rustling in the uncertain breeze. Her face contorted as she sampled the air. "The magic, it tastes wrong. Like time-worn spells unraveling at the seams." A sudden realization hit Thorne like a thunderbolt. The pieces clicked together: Vector's laboratory, the stolen emotional water, the dying vine. His perpetual cloud of gloom crackled with unusual energy, sending tiny sparks of gray lightning around his shoulders. "I know what he's planning." Thorne spun toward Zinnia, nearly knocking over a display of wine bottles. "The master vine, it's not just dying, it's being drained. Vector's using its concentrated essence. All those years of absorbed emotions, he's going to use them to create something permanent." "A town-wide elixir," Zinnia whispered, her gold-flecked eyes widening. "We have to stop him." They raced through the twisting streets, Thorne's gloom cloud streaming behind him like a banner. Vector's hidden laboratory lay beneath an abandoned flower shop, its entrance concealed behind a wall of withered roses. Thorne's presence had actually helped maintain the disguise, as no one questioned why plants died near this particular building. The laboratory door burst open under their combined strength. Inside, massive glass vats lined the walls, filled with swirling iridescent liquid, the stolen emotional water from the falls. Vector stood at a central workbench, his hands moving over an intricate array of tubes and bottles. The air tasted of artificial feelings and corrupted dreams. Ah, the walking rain cloud and the woman who can't control her own emotions. Vector barely looked up from his work. Here to appreciate true perfection? This has to stop, Thorne growled, his cloud darkening. You're destroying the town's natural balance. Vector laughed, the sound sharp as broken glass. Balance? This town is chaos. Random emotions flying everywhere, people feeling whatever they want, whenever they want. I'm bringing order. Perfect, controlled harmony. He gestured to a chair where Mayor Elderberry sat with a vacant smile, eyes unfocused. See? Pure contentment. No more messy feelings. You've turned her into a puppet. Zinnia's voice cracked with horror. I've made her better. Vector grabbed a bottle of swirling purple liquid. Perhaps a demonstration? The bottle flew through the air. Thorne's gloom cloud instinctively expanded, neutralizing the artificial emotion before it could reach them. The liquid fell harmlessly to the floor, its magical properties nullified. Vector's face twisted. He began hurling bottles rapidly, concentrated rage that burned red as fresh blood, bottled despair that wept black tears, crystallized joy that sparkled too brightly to be real. Thorne's gloom created safe zones in the chaos, while Zinnia ducked and weaved between the emotional explosions. If I can't perfect you. Vector's hand closed around a shelf of bottles. Then I'll drown you in imperfection. The shattering of glass was deafening. Hundreds of emotional cocktails broke at once, releasing a tsunami of artificial feelings. Thorne watched in horror as Zinnia stumbled, overwhelmed by the assault on her empathic senses. She clutched her head, drowning in the taste of 1,000 manufactured emotions. Zinnia? Thorne reached for her as she collapsed, his gloom cloud crackling with protective energy. The wave of artificial feelings crashed around them, while Vector's laughter echoed through the laboratory. Thorne watched in horror as Zinnia crumpled under the weight of Vector's emotional assault. Her usual grace dissolved into trembling confusion as the manufactured feelings bombarded her senses. His protective instinct surged, but Vector was already moving, pulling a shimmering contract from his coat with theatrical flourish. Such a waste of talent, Vector crooned, the parchment glowing with an unnatural light. Sign this and I'll spare your precious vine. No more overwhelming emotions, no more losing control. I'll curate everything you taste, pure, perfect, controlled feelings. Thorne's chest tightened as Zinnia struggled to focus her gold-flecked eyes on the contract. The artificial emotions swirling around them had left her vulnerable, her natural defenses stripped away. Vector's words seemed to echo with hypnotic resonance in the chaos-filled laboratory. For years, Thorne had fought against his gloomy nature, tried to suppress the cloud that followed him everywhere. But watching Vector manipulate Zinnia's gift, her beautiful, messy, genuine ability to taste emotions, something shifted inside him. The perpetual melancholy he'd always viewed as a curse suddenly felt like exactly what they needed. He stopped fighting. The cloud around him expanded dramatically, growing darker and more substantial. The laboratory's enchanted lights flickered and dimmed as his gloom spread across the ceiling like ink in water. The artificial emotions began dissipating where his cloud touched them, absorbed into the supernatural darkness. Vector barely spared him a glance. Parlor tricks won't save her. He grabbed Zinnia's arm, yanking her toward the contract. From his pocket, he produced a small vial of clear liquid. Perhaps a sample of your future? A single drop fell onto Zinnia's lips before Thorne could reach them. Her face went slack, eyes widening in horror. I can't. There's nothing. No taste, no feeling, just emptiness. Perfect neutrality, Vector said, satisfaction dripping from his words. Now about that contract. Thorne's gloom crackled with energy. He'd spent so long trying to bring light to things, but maybe what they needed was his darkness. His natural melancholy wasn't artificial like Vector's potions, it was real, raw, honest. The cloud around him began to rain, soft drops that carried the weight of genuine emotion. Where his rain touched Vector's magical implements, they began to dissolve. The contract in Vector's hands sizzled as drops hit it, the binding magic unable to withstand the pure force of natural feeling. Vector's face contorted in rage as the parchment dissolved into nothing. No. Vector lunged for his workbench, grabbing the last bottle of concentrated emotions. I won't let you ruin everything. But Zinnia had recovered enough to stand, her empathic abilities resonating with Thorne's authentic gloom. As Vector raised the bottle, their combined powers, his purifying melancholy, and her emotional rejection, created a feedback loop of genuine feeling. The bottle shattered in Vector's hands, its contents turning back on him. Vector screamed as years of bottled emotions crashed through his carefully constructed walls. Joy, sorrow, anger, love, all the feelings he tried to control and contain now consumed him. He collapsed to the floor, overwhelmed by the very chaos he'd sought to eliminate. The laboratory door burst open as magical law enforcement officers poured in, their badges glowing with official authority. They quickly secured Vector, who could only babble incoherently about perfect emotional harmony. Zinnia moved to Thorne's side, her hand finding his in the dimness. You saved me, she whispered. By being exactly who you are. Through the laboratory's window, they could see the falls in the distance, pulsing with a color that seemed to capture both her warmth and his shadow, a deep purple tinged with silver, like twilight caught in a bottle. But the master vine's branches were still gray and lifeless against the sky, a reminder that their victory wasn't complete. We need to hurry, Zinnia said, squeezing his hand. The vine won't last much longer. Thorne nodded, his cloud settling into a gentle drizzle around them. They'd stopped Vector, but saving the heart of Whimsica Falls would require something more. As the law enforcement officers led Vector away, Thorne and Zinnia turned their attention to the greater challenge ahead, restoring the natural balance of emotions to their beloved town. Chapter 11, A Tale of Two Vintages. Dawn crept over the mood vine, painting the withered master vine in shades of gray that matched Thorne's skin. He stood beside Zinnia, their shoulders nearly touching as they faced the ancient plant. His perpetual cloud hung low and heavy above them, but for once he didn't try to suppress it. I've spent my whole life fighting this, Thorne said, watching his shadow stretch across the ground. The familiar weight of failure pressed against his chest. How many plants had withered under his care? But something felt different now. After confronting Vector, after seeing the damage that artificial control could do, maybe it was time to try another way. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, letting his natural gloom flow outward instead of trying to contain it. The cloud above darkened and expanded, but this time it felt right. Natural. Like finally stretching after being cramped for too long. Thorne, Zinnia whispered, grabbing his arm. Look. He opened his eyes to see the master vine's withered branches moving, reaching toward his shadow like desperate fingers stretching toward water. The motion was subtle but unmistakable. The nearly dead vine was responding to his gloom. Zinnia stepped closer to the vine, her gold-flecked eyes unfocused in that way they got when she was using her ability. She'd been through so much with Vector's emotional manipulation, but her gift remained strong. She pressed her palm against the vine's trunk and inhaled sharply. Your gloom, she said, wonder creeping into her voice. It tastes like fertile soil after rain. Like the necessary darkness before dawn. She turned to him, eyes bright. It's not death at all, it's transformation. Thorne felt something shift inside him, decades of self-doubt cracking like ice in spring. You're sure? Try something specific, she suggested. Instead of letting it spread everywhere, direct it to where shadow-loving plants would naturally grow. He concentrated, guiding his cloud to hover over a patch of struggling moonflowers. The plants had been wilting in the recent harsh sunlight, but as his controlled shade fell over them, their leaves began to perk up. Within minutes, they were stretching toward his gloom like old friends. Zinnia moved through the vineyard, her vintage dress swishing against the grass as she touched plants and tasted the emotional atmosphere. "Here," she called, pointing to a corner where some vines were getting too much sun. "They need balance." Together, they began experimenting. Thorne created pockets of shade where it was needed, while Zinnia's emotional attunement helped identify which plants were struggling. The garden began developing a natural rhythm, sunny spots dappled with shadow, bright flowers complemented by darker foliage. It wasn't about eliminating either light or darkness, but finding harmony between them. His cloud rumbled softly, and the first drops of rain began to fall. But this wasn't his usual gloomy drizzle. These drops carried something different. Natural melancholy, yes, but also acceptance, understanding, the kind of sadness that cleanses rather than destroys. The master vine's branches trembled as the drops hit them, absorbing his rain with obvious hunger. "The color," Zinnia gasped, watching as the vine's gray bark began to shift. Purple spread through its branches like wine filling a glass, deep and rich and healthy. "It's healing." As they worked, Thorne noticed Zinnia's movements becoming more confident. She no longer flinched when tasting the vineyard's emotional atmosphere, instead taking measured sips like a sommelier at a tasting. "I can control it better now," she explained, catching his questioning look. "Instead of being overwhelmed by every feeling, I can adjust how much I let in. It's like properly decanting a wine instead of trying to drink straight from the bottle." The sun climbed higher, and with it came signs of the town's magic stabilizing. The mood-sensing lamps that lined the vineyard paths settled into a steady glow, displaying new colors that seemed to capture both light and shadow. Through the morning mist, they could see the falls in the distance, their waters shimmering with balanced emotions, joy and sorrow, excitement and peace, all flowing together in natural harmony. Thorne watched as his rain continued to nourish the master vine, each drop carrying a bit of his natural gloom. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to apologize for his nature. The vine wasn't just surviving his influence, it was thriving because of it. "Every garden needs shadows," Zinnia said softly, slipping her hand into his. "Every emotion has its place." She squeezed his fingers, and nearby a cluster of night-blooming jasmine unfurled its petals, releasing its sweet scent into his gentle rain. The morning light caught in Zinnia's purple-tinted hair as she turned to face him. Around them, the mood vine had transformed into something new, not the purely bright space it had been before, nor the withered garden it had become under Vector's influence, but a balanced sanctuary where both light and shadow could flourish. Thorne heard Marigold's sharp intake of breath before he saw her. His former boss stood at the vineyard's entrance, her usual sunny aura dimmed by shock as she took in the transformed garden. He braced himself for another lecture about proper plant care, but for once she seemed speechless. "Ms. Brightbloom," he acknowledged, continuing to direct his cloud toward a patch of shade-loving ferns. The plants unfurled beneath his attention, their fronds stretching luxuriously in the gentle darkness. "This is..." Marigold stepped closer, examining a climbing rose that had wound itself around a trellis. The plant displayed an unusual growth pattern. Some blooms reached for the sun while others nestled in thorns provided shadows, creating a stunning cascade of light and dark. "How are you doing this?" "He stopped fighting his nature," Zinnia explained, emerging from behind the master vine. "Turns out some plants need shadow as much as others need sun." Marigold circled the garden, her botanical expertise evident in her careful inspection. "The balance is remarkable. These moonflowers shouldn't be thriving alongside sun-loving marigolds, and yet..." She gestured to a bed where the two species coexisted perfectly, each flourishing in their respective light conditions. "Would you like to see something else?" Thorne asked, feeling an unfamiliar surge of pride. At Marigold's nod, he concentrated on his cloud, letting it produce the gentle rain he'd discovered earlier. The drops fell soft and steady, carrying traces of his natural melancholy. The effect was immediate. The master vine's branches swayed, and before their eyes buds began forming along its length. Within minutes, they burst open into flowers unlike anything Thorne had ever seen, deep purple petals edged in silver, their centers dark as twilight but gleaming with an inner light. "Impossible," Marigold whispered. "The master vine hasn't flowered in decades." Throughout the morning, townspeople began arriving, drawn by news of the garden's transformation. Thorne watched as Zinnia worked with each visitor, her newfound control evident in the way she approached their emotional states. She no longer recoiled from their feelings, but sampled them carefully, like a master sommelier evaluating vintage wines. "There's still artificial joy here," she told one woman gently, "but underneath it I taste your natural happiness. Let's work on bringing that forward instead." Her gold-flecked eyes remained clear and focused, no longer overwhelmed by the emotional bombardment. As the day progressed, Thorne maintained his careful balance of shadow and light throughout the vineyard. He noticed how people lingered in his shaded areas, finding comfort rather than depression in the gentle gloom. Children played in his rain, their laughter mixing with the soft patter of drops in a way that made his chest tight with unexpected emotion. Near sunset, Zinnia called everyone together for the first tasting of wine from the renewed master vine. Thorne stood beside her as she poured the deep purple liquid into crystal glasses. The wine caught the light strangely, seeming to hold both brightness and shadow in its depths. Zinnia lifted her glass first, closing her eyes as she sampled the vintage. "Oh," she breathed, and Thorne could see tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "It's everything. Truth, yes, but not just raw truth. There's wisdom here and acceptance. The joy of summer sunshine and the peace of winter twilight. The strength that comes from embracing all parts of ourselves." The townspeople sipped their wine, and Thorne watched their expressions shift from uncertainty to understanding. The falls in the distance began to shimmer with a color he'd never seen before, not the simple primary colors of basic emotions, but something complex and beautiful, like mother of pearl caught in changing light. As the crowd dispersed, Thorne found himself alone with Zinnia in the garden they'd created together. His cloud hung above them, no longer a source of shame, but a natural part of the vineyard's atmosphere. The master vine's new flowers glowed softly in the gathering dusk, their silver edges catching the last rays of sunlight. "We did it," Zinnia said, moving closer to him. "We found the balance this town needed." When she kissed him, Thorne didn't hold back his nature. His cloud deepened, his natural gloom flowing freely, but now it was part of a greater whole. Around them plants swayed in perfect harmony, neither wilting nor overgrowing, but existing in the space between light and shadow. The garden had become like their kiss, a blend of sunshine and rain, joy and melancholy, each element essential to its beauty. Above them, the falls continued to shine with that new, complex color, reflecting the truth they'd discovered together, that real happiness isn't about banishing the darkness, but about finding beauty in all of life's shades. Chapter 12, Perfectly Aged. The evening light cast a magical glow across the mood vine, as Zinnia adjusted the last of the floating lanterns. Each orb drifted into its perfect position, creating an intricate dance of light and shadow that made the vineyard look like something from a fairy tale. Her heart swelled as she gazed at the master vine, its leaves shifting between deep emerald and brilliant gold, a testament to the balance they'd finally achieved. "The lighting's perfect," Thorne said, materializing beside her with his characteristic cloud of gentle darkness. These days his presence made the lanterns glow softer, more intimate, rather than snuffing them out entirely. "It's all perfect," Zinnia agreed, reaching for his hand. The touch sent a pleasant shiver through her empathic senses, his contentment blending with her joy in a way that felt like home. Townspeople streamed through the entrance, their excited chatter filling the evening air. Pepper buzzed between groups, her wings catching the lantern light as she served her special balanced brew from floating copper kettles. The coffee released spirals of steam that formed tiny laughing faces before dissolving into the twilight. "Anyone else feeling absolutely magnificent?" Pepper called out, her natural enthusiasm amplified by her own creation. "Just the right amount of buzz, if I do say so myself." Near the vineyard's center, Marigold orchestrated an impressive display of solar magic. Golden orbs of light rose from her hands, weaving through Thorne's gentle storm clouds to create an aurora-like effect. The resulting twilight made everything look like it was painted in watercolors. "Now that's what I call cooperation." Marigold beamed at Thorne. "Though I still have a few sunshine potions if you're interested." "I think I'll stick with my natural gloom," Thorne chuckled, and Zinnia felt the warmth in his words despite their shadowy nature. At the disposal station, Vector's confiscated emotional cocktails were being systematically released into Thorne's purifying rain. Zinnia approached each bottle, her supernatural senses cataloging the transformation. The artificial feelings dissolved into the cleansing droplets, leaving behind something pure and true. "It's remarkable," she told the gathered crowd, closing her eyes to better process the sensation. "Like watching storm clouds clear to reveal stars. All that manufactured intensity becoming something gentle and real." Around them, Whimsica Falls settled into its new rhythm. The mood-sensing lamps that lined the paths now displayed subtle gradients instead of harsh single colors. Where they once flashed bright yellow for joy or deep blue for sadness, they now showed complex blends that better reflected the true nature of emotions. The famous falls themselves had never looked more beautiful, cascading with layers of color that shifted like an oil painting in motion. Even the cobblestones beneath their feet seemed happier, humming with balanced energy that made walking feel like floating. Children skipped across them, their laughter adding musical notes to the stone's contented song. "Watch this," Thorne said, stepping into a clearing. He raised his hands, and a canopy of gentle gloom spread overhead. Instead of wilting the surrounding plants, phosphorescent flowers began to bloom, their petals glowing with an inner light that complemented the darkness. A group of children ran toward his rain clouds, faces upturned in delight as they discovered the sparkling droplets mixed with the rain. Their joy echoed through Zinnia's empathic senses, pure and sweet as summer berries. "Mr. Shadowmaker," one little girl called out. "Can you make the raindrops dance?" Thorne smiled, a real full smile that didn't cause a single leaf to shrivel, and conducted the drops into a swirling pattern that had the children spinning in circles. Zinnia gathered everyone around the master vine, where glasses of their new signature wine waited on floating trays. The vine's tendrils swayed gently, its leaves cycling through a spectrum of colors that reflected the complex emotions of the gathered crowd. "Friends," Zinnia began, lifting her glass, "I'd like you to try our newest vintage, Twilight Balance." She closed her eyes, letting the wine's character flow through her supernatural senses. "It tastes like joy that understands sorrow, and peace that embraces complexity. Like the moment between sunset and starlight, when everything is possible." As she spoke, the master vine responded, its colors shifting in a mesmerizing display. Deep purples melted into warm golds, while threads of silver and midnight blue wove through the leaves. It was beautiful, complex, and perfectly balanced, just like the community gathered beneath its branches. The assembled townspeople raised their glasses, and Zinnia felt the moment crystallize in her heart. Pepper hovering near the refreshment table, her wings creating tiny rainbows, Marigold conducting her light show with theatrical flourish, the children still playing in Thorne's glittering rain, and Thorne himself standing tall and finally at peace with who he was. Zinnia's empathic senses tingled as the matchmaking committee surrounded her and Thorne, their divining runes glowing with an intensity she'd never witnessed before. Elder Rosemary, her silver hair adorned with prophetic crystals, held up a particularly bright stone. "In all my years of reading romantic alignments," Elder Rosemary declared, "I've never seen the runes so decisive. Light and shadow, perfectly balanced." She gestured to where the stones had arranged themselves in a spiraling pattern. "Like a well-aged wine, your energies have matured into something extraordinary." Zinnia felt the truth of it in her bones, her supernatural senses confirming what the runes revealed. The taste in the air was rich and complex, like a vintage that had found its perfect moment to be uncorked. Later, as they walked through Vector's transformed laboratory, Zinnia's ability detected the remarkable shift in the space's emotional resonance. Where artificial feelings had once saturated every surface, genuine emotions now settled like soft dust motes in sunbeams. She ran her fingers along a workbench, sampling the lingering essence. "It's fascinating," she told Thorne, closing her eyes to better process the sensations. "The manufactured emotions have dissolved completely. What's left feels like truth settling into comfortable silence." Thorne examined the reformed space, his natural gloom creating gentle shadows that somehow made the laboratory feel cozier. From emotional manipulation to harmony research. Quite the transformation. Back at the celebration, Zinnia noticed something unusual forming in the air above them. Thorne's ever-present cloud was shifting, its edges curling and meeting to form a heart. She watched his expression change from surprise to deliberate concentration as he maintained the shape, adding subtle swirls that made it look like a valentine drawn in smoke. "Show off," she teased, but her delight must have been obvious because his smile widened and the heart gained more definition. Around them, the garden's plants responded with subtle new growth, tender shoots unfurling, leaves stretching ever so slightly toward the balanced light and shadow. The music changed to something slow and sweet, and Thorne extended his hand. "May I have this dance?" As they moved together through the vineyard, his natural shadows and the evening light created an ethereal spotlight that followed their steps. Above them, the master vine seemed to catch their rhythm, its color-changing leaves swaying in time with their movements. Golds melted into purples, silvers shimmered into blues, each shade flowing into the next like wine being poured. Pepper appeared suddenly beside them, practically vibrating with excitement. "The arbor. You simply must go to the arbor." Her wings created tiny whirlwinds of rose petals as she pointed toward the structure. "It's the perfect moment. My buzz sense is never wrong about these things." The enchanted arbor beckoned, its fairy lights twinkling invitingly. As they stepped beneath it, Zinnia felt the magnetic pull between them intensify. When Thorne leaned down to kiss her, she tasted the perfect blend of their energies, his cool shadows mellowing the bright sparkle of the fairy lights, while her emotional warmth gave his darkness depth and dimension. The vineyard itself seemed to sigh around them, vines curling contentedly in the balanced atmosphere. As evening settled into night, they found themselves on the terrace, sharing a glass of their twilight balance wine. Zinnia swirled the liquid, letting her supernatural senses decode its complex profile. Notes of joy danced with threads of thoughtful melancholy, creating something more profound than simple happiness. The town spread out below them, transformed by their achievement. Mood-sensing lamps lined the streets in harmonious hues, no longer flashing extreme colors but glowing with subtle, layered emotions. The famous falls caught the last light of day, its waters shimmering with depths that reflected the community's balanced heart. Their vineyard flourished in the growing darkness, the plants equally happy in light and shadow. Thorne's gloom cloud provided the perfect cover for night-blooming flowers, while breaks in the coverage let starlight pepper the grounds like diamond dust. Zinnia took another sip of wine, savoring how it tasted like their story, bittersweet, joyful, and wonderfully real. The perfect balance of everything they'd become together. Chapter 13: The Master Vine's New Legacy. Zinnia stepped onto the Mood Vine's terrace just as dawn broke over Whimsica Falls. The morning light filtered through Thorne's perpetual cloud cover, creating tiny rainbows in the dewdrops that clung to the vines. She paused, her supernatural senses tingling at an unfamiliar taste in the air, something fresh and mysterious, like the first breath of a new season. That's when she saw them. Sprouting from the Master Vine's ancient trunk were shoots unlike any she'd encountered in her years as a Supernatural Sommelier. The leaves shimmered with a metallic sheen, their color a mesmerizing blend of silver and purple that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "Thorne," she called, unable to contain her excitement. "Come look at this." He emerged from the greenhouse, and something extraordinary happened. The new shoots actually turned toward him, their leaves stretching toward his shadow like eager children reaching for a favorite toy. Zinnia's ability to taste emotions in plants picked up an unexpected sensation, pure contentment, as if the vine had finally found its perfect growing conditions. She plucked a developing grape, rolling it across her tongue. "Oh!" The flavor burst across her palate. "It's like midnight gardens and starlit possibilities. There's depth here I've never experienced before." Marigold arrived in a swirl of golden light, her solar witch powers creating dancing patterns across the vineyard. "I felt the magical shift from across town," she said, adjusting her gardening gloves. "This is unprecedented." As Marigold examined the plants, her natural radiance caused an unexpected reaction. The grapes began to emit a subtle phosphorescent glow, creating a bridge between her light and Thorne's shadow. Rather than choosing sides, the vine seemed to celebrate both. "Fascinating," Marigold murmured, her previous fixed Thorne agenda forgotten in the face of this botanical breakthrough. They're creating their own balance. Later that morning, Zinnia and Thorne stopped by the Buzzing Bean for their daily coffee. Pepper's wings were practically a blur as she zipped between customers, her excitement evident in the extra spark of magic in each cup she served. "Did you see that?" Pepper whispered conspiratorially to Zinnia, nodding toward Vector's former assistant, Roland, who was trying very hard not to stare at Aurora, the new weather witch. "He's been here every morning since she started adjusting our cloud coverage." The coffee machines seemed to agree with Pepper's assessment, whistling a jaunty love song whenever Roland and Aurora's paths crossed. Aurora's cheeks flushed pink, and a light sprinkle of sweet-scented rain fell inside the shop. Back at the vineyard, Zinnia prepared for the moment she'd been anticipating all day. The first bottles of wine from their shadow-loving grapes were ready for tasting. She poured 2 glasses, watching the liquid catch and hold the light in unusual ways. "Ready?" she asked Thorne, lifting her glass. The wine was unlike anything she'd ever tasted. It was like moonlight given liquid form, carrying notes of midnight joy and comfortable melancholy. The mood-sensing lamps around them flickered in appreciation, casting an array of perfectly balanced colors across the tasting room. "It's us," Thorne said softly, watching the wine swirl in his glass. "Everything we've become together." The town council meeting that afternoon was unusually well attended. Mayor Elderberry held up a glass of the new wine, its contents gleaming. "By unanimous vote, we hereby recognize this new variety as Shadowheart grapes, a testament to the unexpected magic that happens when we embrace all aspects of our community." Across the room, Pepper was in her element, orchestrating what she clearly thought was a subtle plan. "Oh dear," she exclaimed, just loud enough to be heard, "I seem to have mixed up these orders." She thrust a complicated coffee concoction into Roland's hands, then Aurora's, ensuring their fingers brushed during the exchange. A sudden gust of warm wind rustled through the Buzzing Bean, carrying the scent of spring flowers. Aurora's weather magic was definitely responding to something, and judging by Roland's besotted expression, it wasn't just the coffee. Zinnia smiled, remembering her own journey to finding unexpected love. She reached for Thorne's hand under the council table, feeling the familiar cool touch of his shadow-kissed skin. Above them, the mood-sensing lamps glowed with a perfect blend of light and dark, while outside their Shadowheart grapes continued to grow, proving that sometimes the most beautiful things flourish in the spaces between. Zinnia couldn't help but smile as she watched Pepper's latest matchmaking scheme unfold at the Buzzing Bean. The Buzz Sprite had outdone herself this time. Every napkin that landed near Roland and Aurora immediately folded itself into an increasingly complex series of heart shapes, some even sprouting tiny paper roses. 3, 2, 1, Zinnia whispered to Thorne just as the shop's self-stirring spoons began tapping out what sounded suspiciously like "Can't Help Falling in Love" against the coffee cups. Aurora jumped, nearly spilling her lavender latte, while Roland rushed to steady her drink. "Subtle as a thunderstorm," Thorne murmured, his perpetual cloud cover thinning just enough to reveal his amused expression. Zinnia's empathic abilities picked up the swirl of emotions in the coffee shop. Pepper's determined excitement, Aurora's shy interest, and Roland's nervous anticipation all blending together like notes in a complex wine. Speaking of which, the master vine seemed to be getting in on the action. Its tendrils, now sporting both their traditional leaves and the new silvery Shadowheart growth, had somehow found their way through the open window and were slowly forming delicate heart shapes above the oblivious couple. "Remember when she tried to trap us in that accidentally locked storage room?" Zinnia asked, taking a sip of her coffee. The taste carried hints of Pepper's matchmaking magic, cinnamon, hope, and just a dash of mischief. "You mean the one that mysteriously unlocked itself the moment we started talking about wine varietals?" Thorne's cloud rippled with amusement. The afternoon brought the first public tasting of their Shadowheart vintage at the Mood Vine. Zinnia's supernatural palate detected subtle shifts in the room's emotional atmosphere as each guest took their first sip. Old Mr. Grumbleworth, notorious for finding fault in everything, blinked in surprise as the wine's balanced properties worked their magic. The perpetual furrow in his brow softened, and Zinnia, tasted the moment his usual bitter notes mellowed into something approaching contentment. "It's like a warm blanket on a rainy day," Mrs. Elderberry said, her mood-sensing brooch shifting to match the wine's unique color. "Comfortable in both the light and shadow." Thorne moved through the crowd with newfound confidence, his controlled gloom creating perfect pockets of shade that enhanced the wine's complexity. Zinnia noticed him, carefully directing one such shadow toward the buzzing beans outdoor seating area, where Pepper had managed to arrange yet another accidental meeting between her chosen couple. "Oh my, this sun is quite bright," Pepper announced at a volume that carried clearly across the street. "What a fortunate coincidence that there's this lovely shaded spot, perfect for two people to share a coffee and conversation." The falls that gave their town its name seemed to approve of all the day's developments. As the sun began its descent, the cascading water shifted to match the exact shade of the Shadowheart wine, a mesmerizing blend of twilight purple and sterling silver that caught and held the light in impossible ways. Zinnia closed her eyes and let her empathic senses explore the taste of the moment. The air was rich with the flavor of new beginnings, like the first sip of morning coffee, mixed with the satisfying completeness of a perfect meal's final bite. Across the street, she heard Aurora's laugh mingle with Roland's deeper chuckle as they finally settled into real conversation. Later, as the day mellowed into evening, Zinnia and Thorne took their usual spots on the Moodvine's terrace. They shared a glass of their special vintage, watching as the master vine's new growth created a gentle light show above them. The Shadowheart tendrils glowed with a soft internal luminescence, casting intricate patterns that danced between light and shadow. Pepper zipped past their table, her wings trailing sparks of satisfaction. "They're going on a proper date tomorrow," she announced, practically vibrating with joy. "I merely mentioned that the new botanical gardens display is lovely at sunset, and they both agreed it would be worth visiting. Together. At the same time. Pure coincidence, of course." "Of course," Zinnia agreed, tasting the Buzzsprite's barely contained glee. It reminded her of champagne bubbles and birthday cake, with an undertone of triumphant cinnamon. The master vine stretched lazily overhead, its original growth now perfectly intertwined with the Shadowheart additions. A tendril curled down to gently tap Zinnia's glass, and she caught the distinct emotional flavor of contentment, the same feeling she'd first detected when the new variety had emerged. "I think," she said to Thorne, watching the falls continue to shimmer with their wine's signature color, "we've finally found our perfect blend." Thank you for listening. Please visit me at wynnvalentine.com to stay up to date. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and review on Amazon.